When you look at these people who start putting everything they ever do online, they pretty much always will go a little crazy. I really do think that says something about the normal cases of people putting their life online.
You're listening to the Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Owen Cyclops about internet ethnography. Owen is an illustrator who creates mystical Christian art, and he actually did the cover of my book, The Intactivist Guidebook. He also has a lot of amazing art and t-shirts that you can find on owencyclops.com. What drew me to this conversation was his threads online talking about the ethnography of the internet, how the internet changes society and the psychology of people who use it. So you may have noticed that over the past few years, the internet has made things a little weirder. And the internet has moved from being not real life to actually deeply influencing our real life. And in this conversation, we explore exactly how the internet does that and how it's changed over time. We also talk about French postmodernism, meta-narratives, and how to create art in the age of the internet. This is our longest episode yet, but it is well worth it. Now, here is Owen. I think that you show prep the same way that I do, which is to write down every single topic or question you could go into. Because you sent me some Twitter threads that were ones that I had searched and found again while preparing for the show. Yeah, this is a bit meta in and of itself because we're going to be talking about internet ethnography. Since we're going to be talking about internet ethnography, you and I met online through Twitter. My face is all over the internet at this point, but you are pseudonymous. So you have your online presence and your art as separate from your real life presence. There's multiple levels of internet, even in our meeting. And of course, meta is something we'll get into.
No, yeah, I figured we'd talk about all that stuff. You talked about the notes and like how to prep it. It's funny because I guess that's also like a ethnographic thing, but like for this type of thing, I feel like I take a ton of notes and I lay it all out in like a diagram or something. But then when it starts, it just kind of unfolds naturally. Anyway, you almost can't really control it.
Well, the thing I wanted to start with is the question of what you consider internet ethnography. So what does that term mean?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I never really imagined that I would spend so much time thinking about the internet in and of itself. I guess maybe that's because I think that in the past I would have been a pretty unlikely candidate for that. I've always been pretty online by virtue of being a nerdy guy in this time period.
Right.
But I was pretty low tech for a very large portion of my life, and I resisted the grip of new tech as hard as I possibly could for as long as I possibly could. So I guess it feels kind of dated at this point to flex about it, but I was the last person I knew to not have a smartphone. I didn't even have a Facebook page or anything like that for a really long time until I started missing out on real life things by not having a Facebook, which is in and of itself kind of an interesting, weird topic. So I lived resisting the grip of the internet into my real life as long as possible. And I think maybe that's part of why I started thinking about it so much. I guess I'm getting a little bit into myself, but to answer the question, ethnography, I don't know if most people know that term, but it just means the study of people. You know, anthropology is you go back and look at people from a long time ago. That's generally how people think of it colloquially anyway. So I think of ethnography as it's sort of like anthropology, but the people are still around doing something right now. One of my favorite examples, I think it's pretty classic in the field of ethnography, is people go to these other countries, maybe in Africa, maybe in Southeast Asia, and will observe some aspect of their culture and write about the larger implications of it. I really got turned on to the idea of it when I read this essay that was all about cockfighting in Bali, of all things. This guy went to Bali and they had this really hardcore rooster fighting culture there. So he explicates, what it's like, and they own these roosters and where they keep them and how they do it. But I think the thing that really flipped a switch in my brain was at the end, he said there's this acknowledgement in their culture that ultimately people are just kind of getting their roosters. If they're strong, they're strong. If they're weak, they're weak. And there is this randomness to it. So a big part of their culture was built around this sport basically, but they sort of subconsciously acknowledged that it was a little bit random and it had to do with their view of life and luck and providence and things like that. And it really turned on this switch in my brain of, if you zoom in to a small piece of a culture, that will often illuminate larger things about people's worldview and how they see things. I guess that's somewhat obvious, but at the time it really like flipped a big switch in my brain. So I bring that to the internet in a way, not intentionally, just because the internet basically has become real life over the last few years, really.
An interesting part of what you mentioned was that you and I both were early adopters of the internet, but very slow to bring the internet into real life. So I did the same thing. I was actually slow to get a phone that could do text messaging.
Nice.
Then later was slower to adopt smartphones. And for a while, had no social media of any kind. I'd had social media for a while, and I literally deleted it all. And then didn't get it again until I had a professional reason for the film promotion I was doing, and it made sense to get it. And even then, I interacted with it differently. And I think that, you mentioned people going to other cultures and observing them and writing about them. There's a sense in which after you do that, if you come back to your own culture, you experience culture shock, because culture shock is something people experience when they go somewhere else. They see how the people there live and they go, oh my goodness, this is so different. How, why do they do this? How do people live like that? But if you live in another country long enough, you get used to it. And then that becomes your culture. It becomes a normal culture for you. And what happens is that when people go home back to their original culture, the place they grew up seems foreign because they've gotten used to something different. And it sounds like for you and I, because we in some way grew up on the internet, there is a reluctance to move there because we're aware that this is a different culture. And if it becomes the culture of, quote unquote, the real world of everyday life, that's going to change how people interact, and that's going to change how they behave towards each other. So that could be good in some ways and it could be bad in others. So I'd like to get into that of like, what is the culture of the internet, and when did the culture of the internet or the way that people live and exist on there become real life?
Yeah, that is so well said what you described, where you go to foreign place, get used to it, come back home, and you start seeing things differently in a way. That's such a perfect analogy. I thought about it before the show, and I pinned down one or two specific examples of the first times that I noticed that something was changing in terms of the relationship between the internet and real life. One of them that at the time seemed really incidental, but now it sticks out in my mind because this would never happen now. I was on some forum for some video game. I think it was StarCraft or something. One of the people posting on the forum, he tagged one of the moderators in the forum and said, I'm 13 and this guy's threatening me on the forum. And if you guys don't do something about it, I'm going to call the police. And everyone laughed about it. And one of the moderators responded saying like, I'm going to come to your house and, I'll tone it down a little bit and beat you up. And we all laughed about it. And it sticks out in my mind because at that point, the idea of consequences online bleeding into real life literally was a joke. It's something that people would have laughed about. It wasn't that long ago. There's also this other more sort of pressing and relevant example. I used to be more into, actually I'm still into it, weird politics, weird fringe people. And when I was younger, I was into punk music. I got into all these like anarchist websites and things like that. And I remember really vividly, there was a website, it was called raisethefist.org, and it was sort of like a news conglomeration website. And I remember I came home one day and read this news article about how the guy that ran the site got arrested because I think he linked to some other website that had some shady information on it, something like that. I don't know if it was really legitimate or not. But the point is that I was just sitting there thinking, wow, he got arrested for something he did on his website. And the idea of there being consequences for things online was such a radical, crazy concept for me that I almost couldn't really believe it. I really couldn't believe that there were people somewhere in an office that went online and found some activity and then went to go investigate it. Again, I guess that sounds super naive now, but at the time they were totally separate worlds.
Well, that was the assumption that everyone had online. So there actually was a cultural assumption that the internet is not real life. There was this saying that the internet's not real life. They literally say that. And they would also tell people, don't use your real name online, that you should have a separate identity online than you do in real life. And I think what changed that is when advertisers got online. And when everything revolved online around advertising, they wanted you to use your real name. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, everyone should use their real name online. Whereas before, it would be like a joke that you would ask someone, hey, what's your email? And they would give like some silly handle. You'd hear like, oh, it's such and such a fan 67. And you're like,
Yeah.
what, that's the handle you chose? It would be like a joke that, and later people would have to learn, okay, I need a professional email that's got some sort of real name on it or something that I will feel comfortable telling my colleagues. But for a while it was always something like that, and the online identity was completely different.
Yeah, and I think that the social mediaization of the internet is probably my largest factor there. You touched on it a second ago, but you mentioned, you only really got into that realm of, I guess you could say, porting your life online to promote your film. And I have an analogy with that because the main reason I'm online, or maybe it's just what I tell myself, is getting my art out there. I make art, I post it online. It's a pretty 1, 2, 3 connection. And I think that makes it so you and I, at least, even if it's not true, even if we both hang out online too much, I don't know if you do, but I probably do.
Probably.
We can at least tell ourselves, I'm
Right.
here for this reason though. And I remember thinking, but why are other people, like, what are you guys doing on Facebook? What are you guys doing on these social media sites that I'm not on? And you mentioned, when did it become real life? I don't know if this was specific to the professions that I was in, but I remember both professionally and in terms of just meeting normal people started to think it was creepy that I didn't have any normal social media. And that was one of the real times where I thought, wait, what's going on here? Because I was living in the few years ago world where we were all making fun of people posting selfies on social media, and everyone's making fun of social media, and oh my God, it's this really dumb thing. And now I'm at a job interview and this woman is giving me an odd look because I don't have a Facebook page. And I think slow little transitions like that are part of how the gap was bridged, basically.
I wonder if that reaction came from the fact that people would think that you did have one, but there was something on it that you didn't want to show to an employer.
Yeah, maybe.
Because that would mean that it's outside their reality that you wouldn't have a Facebook. I almost wonder if it's that you're so far outside their reality, it's a little uncomfortable for them, or if it's because they would just assume you're a part of their reality and it's somehow different.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe you're right. Well, I definitely experienced that with smartphones also. You really tricked something in my brain when you mentioned it before about going somewhere and then coming back home, because I think that happening with smartphones is also something that is so underappreciated. I think that people don't really appreciate how crazy it is, the larger consciousness shift that happened with smartphones. With like semiotics, that's another study of, how things mean things, and ethnography. You sort of always end up in this place where, I was joking with my wife before. It's like you're looking at a Coke can and you're like, but why is it red? And at the same time, it's super deep, but it also seems really trivial to be focusing on this random little detail.
Right.
So you always end up in that kind of space. But even though people talk about it, I really feel like the consciousness shift that happened when we all got phones, and if you can remember what it was like before then, I mean, it almost makes you superhuman in a way, not even exaggerating. I remember when I didn't have one and I would meet other people. My cousin one time sat me down and he said, you don't even know what you're missing. You don't even know what this other mode of life is like. And I thought he was exaggerating. And then when I got one, again, with the traveling metaphor, you made me think of it. It's almost hard to remember what it was like before then. I mean, I remember going to restaurants, sitting by myself and just eating alone, and I didn't have my phone with me, obviously. So what was I doing? And I can remember it conceptually, but to actually have lived in that reality, it seems strange, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah. So I actually have a story that I heard about that, which was, I saw an interview with the comedian Trevor Moore, and he was talking about, he remembers the exact weekend the iPhone came out, because he was shooting a TV show. And he said you'd be on set, and in between takes, everyone would talk with each other and joke and have a conversation, because you're on set, you're on there for 12 hours a day, and there's nothing else to do. And of course, the weekend the iPhone came out, everyone was excited. They got their iPhone, and so they were constantly playing with it between takes. And he said he figured that first weekend, they'd be excited about their new toy, and they would do stuff with it. And then we'd go back to, talking and chatting between takes. And that never happened, because they never got off the iPhone. Like every time that now on a film set, when there's a break between takes, what do you do when you're bored? You pull out your phone and you start scrolling. It used to be the internet was a place that you would go. Like, I remember when growing up, people would have the family computer because families couldn't afford more than one computer. And it would be in the living room. And you would have to go to the computer and decide you wanted to go online because it wasn't a space that you could take with you. And so before, like you mentioned, you'd be at a restaurant, you would be at the restaurant. But if you think of the internet as a place, and even within the internet, there's different places, right? So if you're on Twitter, like people use spatial language, you're on Twitter or you're on Facebook, those are two different places. And then people will even use terminology to distinguish between different spaces within that. So if you're on weird Twitter, that's different than being on academic Twitter. And it sounds like what happened was now every place has an immediate portal to somewhere else through the internet. And that means that not just that when people are there, they can space out and go online, but the internet can come through that portal into the physical space itself in some way.
Yes. Oh my God, yes. Yeah, I have a really interesting example of that actually. Before we get too far from it, we kind of touched a little bit on the implications for social dynamics, but one really just other last interesting example, because I don't know what other people's lives are like, but I was in a unique situation where I was able to experience this. And it also was like almost like a flashbang that went off that illuminated all these other things. So you mentioned people talking and things like that. I studied abroad. I went to Italy. And one of the teachers told me that. They said, to condense it, before phones and computers, this building was packed with people from 6 a.m. to 3 a.m. because you had to come here to talk and hang out with people. And now the building's empty all the time. So I experienced that conceptually like, oh yeah, that's interesting, but what am I going to do about it? But since I was there and I had no money, I had this really crappy phone and the phone didn't work. And that was the situation for a lot of students there. So it's interesting because I got to experience what life was like even before having a cell phone. And it was very interesting in terms of commitments and how we meet up with people. And I think about that all the time now because I don't know what other people's social life is like, but you talk to someone, hey, let's hang out on Friday. Okay, Friday comes. Let's talk. Okay, what are you doing? Nothing, oh, now it's 6 p.m. Hey, should we meet up here? But when we didn't have phones, you had to say, hey, do you want to hang out on Friday? Sure. When? At 3 p.m. Where are we meeting? Let's meet here. And you had to actually meet them there at 3 p.m. So that's, again, a somewhat obvious example. Without phones, you have to lock things in like that. Yeah. And you can take that example and extrapolate it to the omnipresence of the internet and realize that there's trillions of little, very human interactions that have been altered. And who even notices it? Maybe we don't even notice at all.
Well, let's get into that. So now that the internet is real life, or the real life is internet, it goes both ways. What do those changes mean? What does it mean that we now have the ability to connect to this other place everywhere we are?
Yeah. Yeah, man. One model that I have started using in my mind about the internet is that it's a little bit of a paradox in that it's an infinitely horizontal landscape with every point being connected without any distance between those points. I guess that sounds like really heady and weird. But what I mean by that is there's an infinite amount of space. No one on the internet physically takes up space. You could put 1 trillion people on Reddit. You could put 1 trillion people on Facebook. It doesn't really matter. But as you load up that space and it becomes more and more dense, simultaneously, there's no distance between any of those 2 points. Everything's instantly connected in this way where everything is associated. I guess what I'm getting at, to make it way less heady, is, so you mentioned, what does that mean that we're always connected to the internet? I think one of the main things is that we've lost a lot of clarity in terms of, I'm trying to think of a smart way to say that there's always going to be crazy people with opinions that you don't like, or that have atypical views or things like that. And I feel like even though that's somewhat cliche, especially in this particular cultural time period, I really think people don't understand that no matter what, someone will always be able to highlight it and it'll feel like it's 1 inch away because of the model I described. Because you're online and hey, they're on Facebook, you're on Facebook. Wow, all of a sudden it feels like you're sitting 1 inch away from this person that otherwise you would never even think of in real life.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, is that the space between things has been deleted and everything is right next to each other all the time. I'm thinking actually the Bo Burnham song about the internet is, a little bit of everything all of the time, meaning that everything that would have had distance between each other is now immediately there. And I'm thinking about how things were in the real world prior. In the real world prior, you would have had at least a 15-minute drive between each space. I remember growing up, I was into a lot of different nerdy subcultures. I like comic books and Magic the Gathering, and I came from a Christian family, so there were certain sort of Christian spaces we would go to. And later on, I got into the arts, and so there were acting spaces. And of course, actors hang out in very different places often than people who are really into Magic the Gathering or people who are very devout Christians. And so all of those spaces were separate. And now that we're online, in 2 clicks, I can go from this conversation to almost anything, to something that's sort of a really weird, crazy political view. You could go in 2 clicks to pornography. You could go to your friend who you haven't talked to in 20 years. And I remember a comedian talking about how weird it was, this was like 20 years ago, but he was talking about how weird it was that the machine that is teaching his kids to read is also the machine he uses to look at porn. And he was just saying, it feels like those 2 things should be separate in some way, because those are not spaces that you want to collide with each other. And yet all those spaces are immediately next to each other through the internet. And so things which would have existed in their weird little corner as a subculture or as a niche thing are now immediately able to bump up with the mainstream and with spaces that you might not want them to bump up against in a moment.
Yeah, that is so true. And that example of the computer being used for both porn and the kids, reading games, it kind of circles back to something that I was thinking about before. I don't know if I really fully hit on it, but I think that part of what makes this topic interesting and also pressing is that perfectly highlights the ambiguity of what these things are for is also something that we are grappling with without even really understanding it. I mean, the computer example is a good example. In a way, it obscures it a little bit because porn is something dirty, we got to hide it. So that would always be, hopefully, I guess, hidden away. But I think when you apply that to platforms, that also becomes very interesting and weird, because Facebook is a perfect example. I mean, when Facebook first started, it was explicitly just for college kids to connect. I remember actually when you had to have a college email address to get one, and my friend got a Facebook and we all made fun of him. Why do you have this? No one even knew what it was. But over time, all the platforms, it's become somewhat ambiguous what they're actually for and why we're actually on them. It seems like it would be a lot clearer, as per that example, if it was here's the kids learning device and here's the pornography device, but it's all smashed together. And I think different understandings of, how we use those spaces and what they're for, basically, I think is also something that's infecting backwards into the culture. I mean, is Facebook for, weirdo, no offense if they're listening, I guess, furries to meet up? Or is it for keeping track of my grandmother? Or is it for finding weird artists? Or is it for buying a washing machine? Or is it for all of those things?
That's a really interesting point, because different people and different subcultures have different conceptions of what the internet is for. And I really notice it on Twitter, because Twitter is the one that has the most immediate interaction. I remember when I first discovered Twitter, seeing 2 different types of personalities. One was blue checkmark public figures who thought that Twitter was for disseminating, important information about either their professional life or their brand or their journalism. And the other was people who had come from the subculture of places like 4chan or niche blogs or things like that, who thought that Twitter was an amazing space where they could interact with those blue check marks and harass them in ways that they thought were funny. And those are obviously 2 very different conceptions. And the both conflict and strangeness that came from that was the two subcultures interacting with completely different conceptions of what the space was for, and each assuming that their conception was the correct one and the other should just, get along with it. So the people who were trolling were saying, oh, I mean, like, this is funny. Like, can't you take a joke? And the other people were saying, why are you behaving this way? This is harassment. Who taught you to act like this? And they were, genuinely offended. And of course, the other side is like, what are you talking about? Like, it's funny. It's just a joke. Like,
yeah, like we're online. This is what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
You're on the internet. Like, yeah.
And in some way, they were coming from the earlier conception of the internet where everyone was anonymous and the largest platforms weren't Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that. There were things like the Something Awful forums, which, were very lawless, Wild Wild West style places on the internet. Which actually, even that analogy of, the internet being a wild frontier that was settled is itself indicative of it as like a place that people went.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the journalists, people, being mean to them analogy is perfect because you can imagine some of the last spaces that do have an explicit function. Like, for example, LinkedIn. If you went on LinkedIn and you were DMing people, making fun of how they look or something, that would feel inappropriate. And it seems like someone would be totally right to say, hey, I'm on LinkedIn right now. What are you doing? But then when the sort of old internet and new internet mash up and get alongside each other, like you said, you have those like ambiguous interactions where who do you appeal to? Who do you appeal to say, what is this platform for?
I've thought of doing weird stuff on LinkedIn like that, to be honest, because of the documentary I did in my background, being critical of certain organizations or industries is actually part of my professional brand. And so it would be such a pattern interrupt to start behaving that way on LinkedIn. But for my professional career, it would be okay. And it would actually be a part of my brand. Anytime you're doing internet marketing, you want to do something that gets attention and stands out. So I've thought of doing some stuff like that on LinkedIn because it's such a violation of the norms of the platform. People might pay attention to it. Now, I haven't yet for just the reason that I don't see an advantage to it right now. But it occurred to me that in some way, violating the norms of another subculture is a way to get attention, and attention is what's rewarded on the internet. So there's a way in which the internet is kind of messing up the norms of every subculture, which is why now, a lot of social media platforms are really trying to codify exactly what their acceptable conduct and behavior is. And doing that explicitly is really hard because most subcultures just have an unspoken code of what acceptable behavior is. So if you have to put it in writing, that's already really difficult. Like, I don't know if I could just put down all the rules of behavior at a local restaurant. Like, if you were to write all that out, that would actually be a pretty long list and complex if you had to teach it to someone who'd never been to a restaurant before, which actually another story. There's someone I heard about who did that with his kids weeks beforehand. He said, we're going to go to a fancy restaurant. Fancy restaurants have certain rules. And if you want to go to the fancy restaurant, you need to obey those rules. And he said his kids were incredibly well behaved at the restaurant, but they were that way because 4 weeks ahead of time, he was telling them, we're going to go to this place. It's really special. But if you go there, you have to act a certain way. And so his kids understood, okay, well, when we go there, we can't run around. We can't scream and make loud noise. And they had sort of come to an agreement to follow the rules of the platform of a fancy restaurant. And of course, that doesn't happen online. You just sign up in 2 clicks and you can make an account and then do whatever crazy thing you want.
Yeah, no, totally. And then that also exists like inside of like professions and things like that. Like when I used to be more involved in the art world, sometimes if I took someone that I knew was, I guess you could say like uninitiated, sometimes, they'd say something and then later I'd say, it's not a big deal. But like when you say that, you kind of signal that you're an outsider and that,
right.
No offense, but on the subculture front, That's interesting because I also think there was a point where the internet made it so there are no more subcultures in terms of actually being a subculture. I've often used the example of underground music. I know there is still like not popular music, but somehow it feels different than actually underground music. For me, that transition happened with like weird beat music. I don't know if you know who Flying Lotus is and people like that.
I've heard the name, but I don't listen to them.
Yeah, I remember when people showed me that music and it was really difficult to find. And then just a few years later, it was in Grand Theft Auto. He had like a radio station in Grand Theft Auto. So of course music becomes popular, but if I sat down right now and said, you know, what's underground music? It doesn't feel very underground because like we were just saying, if it's on SoundCloud, it's one click away. It's one click away from here. So it's kind of just interesting also in terms of disrupting subcultures. Everyone knows about really weird internet subcultures, even if they're not a part of them because of the spectacle nature of the internet. You touched on one thing that just before it kind of drifts down the river, one deeper paradox that I think that the society at large is wrestling with. So we've kind of covered a lot of, you know, yeah, the internet, like it's real now and it feels crazy, right? Of course, that's true. And there are like weird, interesting sub aspects of it. But I think in terms of how society at large is grappling with some of the deeper implications, that gets really interesting. For example, so you mentioned being online, it rewards, I guess what I'll call crazy, atypical, wild, funny even behavior.
It rewards acting like you're on a reality TV show. Because you kind of are, because you are being watched by everyone when you post online.
Yeah, so it rewards, let's call like out of the boxness. Maybe that kind of feels like it encapsulates a lot of it. Wild out of the boxness, I would say. That's interesting because that is the one thing that a spectacle or an official corporation or an official, that officialness cannot tolerate. Officialness cannot tolerate wild out of the boxness. Yet all of the official and real aspects of our society have been ported over to this media that, like we just said, rewards the exact thing that they can't. It's the one thing they can't really partake of. Even when you see social media brands, you know, that's kind of the cool new thing now. Like, oh, Doritos said, I like My Little Pony or some stupid stuff. Like, who knows? They can never really go over a line and really participate.
I actually saw a Steakums thread that was about the distrust of institutions and why institutions are losing people's trust. And it read like something you would read from an anonymous Twitter account, which was really weird. And I thought simultaneously that it was really brilliant marketing and in terms of getting people's attention. And at the same time, it was probably a bad direction to go, because if other companies start copying it, which if it's successful, they would, then instead of becoming an authentic expression or form of commentary, will become this weird commoditized performance, and it won't be authentic. And what was interesting about it was sounding like the kind of authentic expression you hear from anonymous people. You sent me an article on relatability, and I want to ask about that. There's a way in which people want a performance, this is true of art too, a performance which is authentic and real, but like nothing's really real on the internet. So it is always a performance, but we want it to be real. And that's sort of a strange paradox too that I don't really know how to resolve.
Yeah, see, I love these conversations because it's kind of, you know, it always like folds back in on itself as it like goes deeper. I don't know if I use this word, but I like to think, we talked about, you know, the internet became real life is the internet. I would even take it a step further and say that real life is subservient to the internet now. And that touches on what you just said, where we can't be authentic. You know, what does it even mean to be authentic on the internet? One of my favorite examples, it's from the same semiotic essay. Oh, I didn't even mention it yet. We probably won't, it feels a little tangential. It's not really that relevant, but for the semiotic stuff, a lot of the older guys were dealing in the 70s when life became enmeshed with TV. So we were kind of going through the same thing, except it was a little bit different because of the one-way nature of TV. But that's part of why I've drawn some inspiration from them, because you can see these people, like I just said, going through the same thing, saying, whoa, 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 now society is society plus this device. And what are the implications of that? it's hard for me to imagine not living in a TV-based society. But one of my favorite examples was there was some, French general or someone, I don't even know who it was, and they were entering this catacomb or mausoleum on French TV on the news. And this author noticed when he's walking in the mausoleum, he's holding a single rose because I think it was part of the Socialist Party and a rose is their symbol. So you're watching the camera cut, he's walking in holding the rose, and it's like, wow, what an epic symbol. That's so cool. He gets inside and you see him place 3 flowers on each of these different graves inside the mausoleum. So this author who's obsessed with, media symbols and stuff asks, well, didn't we just see him walk in with a single rose? So what happened? Was someone waiting in the eave to pass him the other flowers? So actually this whole thing was orchestrated really for the TV cameras. So we're watching this solemn moment, but actually this was all planned beforehand to like sneak more flowers in because of the logistics. So it's really all just for the cameras, really, which sounds kind of naive, but it's just a good example. And it's like what you just mentioned. Online, there's the inherent ... but you're putting this online, so it's a performance. So even if, Steakums or Doritos or Wendy's or whatever social media brand, even if they, let's say, nailed it 10 out of 10 out of the park, wow, this feels so authentic, it still couldn't be because of the nature of the medium.
There's a way in which you have to place the camera, and the moment that you're the cameraman, you're not the observer. I was thinking about this too because I have a background in film, and one of the shots or moments that I love in films is a shot of a character thinking, and just them alone thinking and watching an actor's face while they're trying to solve a problem or reacting to a moment. And one of the things that occurred to me when I started creating content, and of course the word content is a whole other discussion we could have, but when I started creating things for distributing online, is that moment is not one that you can have online. Because, what am I going to do? I'm going to set up a camera and then have it watch me sit alone and think about a problem? That doesn't... No one's ever taken that shot. And even if I did, is that going to get attention online? Where people are going to look and be like, there's nothing happening, and scroll past it? Whereas in a film, if you create some stakes and some story, and then there's a moment where the character is reacting to that, you're curious, you're looking at them, you're trying to figure out what's going on inside them. But you're not trying to figure out what's going inside someone on social media because, well, just tell us. If you really want us to know, you'd post it, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because it almost has like the dead air feeling in a way, like the internet partakes of all the media forms that came before it while also being different. So it has like a little bit of the radio aspect, a little bit of the TV aspect. That's interesting also because I think that also has to do with the social mediaization of the internet. I experienced what you just described in a different way because I resisted video for a long time. I do my painting show now, but for a while I was really, I don't want to say concerned because I bring a light, lovely carefreeness to everything I do, but I was concerned a little bit about going over to video because of what you just described. When I'm writing or when I'm doing art, I am 100% totally in control of what goes out. But having those moments where you're not sure or you're thinking, how is that going to come off? It's very interesting. I experienced that on Twitter also because when you see people post, I think there's a very big difference between, and this goes for all media, but like you said, Twitter is an accelerated version of it. I think there's a really big difference between people who eventually take the fork in the road to every time I open my mouth, this is like an authoritative statement that I'm 100% confident on, versus the other fork in the road where, I'm kind of not really sure about anything. It feels like the nature of the internet pushes people into one of those two camps eventually. Showing yourself thinking and the ambiguity that entails and transferring it online is a really interesting thing.
It's also, you mentioned there the process, showing your process, that is, and showing what you're not confident about. That's something that I am not sure to handle as someone who's, got my real face and self online in that way, because sometimes I'm thinking about a problem and I want to throw out an idea to see if it's true, to see what people say about it. But I worry about doing that online because if I throw out a half-baked idea that I'm not sure about and I kind of want a reaction to. Some of those ideas I'm playing with because they might offend people or because I don't know what reaction they'll get. And the danger with doing that on the internet is that if I throw out a, like, oh, I'm thinking about this, I'm not sure, is that someone could recontextualize that idea. So they could screenshot it, they could add an interpretation to it, and then their interpretation of a half-baked idea I was kind of considering is something that someone who, is offended or doesn't like what I have to say would use to then try to brand me a certain way. And I'm always not sure quite how to handle that.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting, man. Yeah, it's almost like you have to have your guard up a little bit in a way, but then at the same time, what people respond to is the genuineness. You kind of made me think of, it goes back to what the meta context is for the specific bits of the internet. Like when you post on Twitter, is it, I'm just in my car and I just thought about this randomly, or is it, I'm kind of a guru, and guess what? This is what you should think. The person reading it brings that context to it. And like you're saying, if they bring a disingenuous or maybe just the wrong context, they could, use it against you. There are certain things I actually don't really talk about on Twitter for that reason exactly. For a long time, it's not really much of a big deal anymore. But for a long time, I really avoided talking about Buddhism online because it's such a nuanced thing that I knew that what you just said would happen, where you have 10 million different definitions for every term. So if I make a thread on Twitter and one of the tweets says, enlightenment is basically when X, Y, and Z happens, it's very easy for someone to come along and say, oh my God, that's not what it is. It's really like this. This guy has no idea what he's talking about. So yeah, it's interesting because also you have to be like on your guard in a way, but then, are you being fake? It's a really weird like tightrope to walk.
That is a good way of putting it, that people bring their own context online. And it's especially because the platforms themselves often don't provide context. So if someone is posting on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or one of these huge platforms, it's not clear what part of Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform they're on. And it's not always clear who they're talking to. And so I noticed this online because I'll just post an observation and I'll get people in the comments responding with the clear perception on their part that I'm a part of a context I'm not. So I'll get people responding like, USJW, liberal snowflake. And then I'll have other people in this replying to the same comment being like, you right wing, like fascist, and I'm like, I'm actually, where is this coming from? And neither of these things are true.
Yeah, I've gotten that in even more weird ways, being on Twitter. And then it's another thing because I feel like part of what I really like about the internet, honestly, is using that ambiguity. I really feel like I didn't intentionally cultivate it, but for my whole life, I think using that ambiguity, it has to do with the Joker archetype a little bit and the jester and, oh, I'm just kidding, but, actually there is something serious here also. That's where I thrive, honestly. So part of me enjoys that ambiguity a little bit. We could talk about that. But I get that also. I posted randomly about me going to Home Depot to get an extension cord. I posted something funny that I thought was funny about it. It wasn't like the most hilarious thing ever. And I get someone commenting like, why would you post this on Twitter? And I'm like, because it's Twitter. That's why you're here. Like, why, And that lack of context, that person's reading it like, oh, Owen thought this was something really important for me to read.
Their context is that you sat down and like really thought about what you wanted to say about your trip to Home Depot, and were like, this is my masterpiece. Here it is.
Yeah, and it's funny that Twitter's almost become partially it's enmeshed with journalism in a way now, because in the beginning that was the total opposite of what the use case was pitched as. It was pitched as you could tweet, I'm eating a sandwich.
It was
LOL,
a text message that you could
of it.
send to everyone. It was very much in the context of texting. And that's actually one of the interesting things that, you had a thread online, which actually, I want to back up. One of my favorite things to watch you do online is when you Now it's weird because I'm revealing that I have been watching the performance, which is a whole other, I'm no longer an observer. By the way, is another strange sort of topic online is every now and then I'll meet someone and they'll say, "Oh, I read that thing you wrote." And I'll think, I didn't realize you were the audience for that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize you were watching that. I might have, maybe said it slightly differently if I'd known. So there's another weird way in which, because there's no context, the audience changes. Whereas if you were in a physical space, if I was in church with people who go to church, I might speak differently than if I was with a bunch of actors hanging out at a bar. Like those are two different contexts, but because the context isn't there, you're not always clear what context you're speaking to. And that brings back to the thread that the thing that I've seen you post about on Twitter. One of my favorite things to watch is when you will talk to an academic and basically ask them questions a 5-year-old might ask about their scientific topic. Like, hey, this sounds really interesting. Can you explain this? And watching someone who considers themselves learned realize that they can't explain something, and the triggered reaction where they will call you anti-science or assume you're one of those, whatever particular conspiracy theory they see these questions as coming from. And it's clear to me that context isn't present in what you're asking, that you really are just like asking questions a 5-year-old might ask about their academic discipline. But because it reveals a lack of knowledge on their part, they get really upset.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, that's why. Thank you. I'm glad you think that's funny. I think it's really funny. I'll often find myself, honestly, not to go too behind the scenes, like literally hysterically laughing, holding my phone on the floor. And my wife will come in and ask, what I'm laughing at. And I'll have to explain something that probably is only funny to me and maybe a few other people online.
It's funny to me.
But yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Well, the thing is, that's part of what is dangerous about, the jester archetype. Classically, I don't know if it's too far left field, but actually the jester really does relate to the internet space in an intrinsic way. That's part of what the jester's social function was. He was one of the only people who could make fun of the king and point out weird things about society, because at the end of the day, I'm just a fool, I'm just an idiot, I'm just joking around. Like, maybe he really is, and then it's not really a facade, maybe he really is an idiot. But that's part of what's dangerous about it. That's something that I really enjoy. I had to tone it down a little bit, to be totally honest with you, because I started getting worried that, I think blue checks have an ability to get you banned on Twitter. I'm kind of like a paranoid Illuminati guy. So I toned it down a little bit, but I do really love doing it, because that's another thing about the internet that is really intriguing to me. You can just talk to, oh, look, this guy's a Harvard PhD lawyer who works for this huge company. This is the expert. You can't imagine in your mind that there's someone more of an expert than this guy. And you can talk to him right now while you're having lunch. And if he can't answer your questions, well, then that's it. You can't imagine that beyond him, there's another guy who, maybe there is another expert, but you get what I'm saying. You can talk to the person that you're imagining behind closed doors and get the information. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that now a lot of these social media platforms are becoming very fragile and triggered around people who play the jester archetype. And I think it's a larger thing that the people who are currently in power really cannot tolerate that archetype, because that archetype is one of the few ones that can criticize them and then frame it as a joke. And of course, the thing that you'll see very often people in positions of power online or in the media do is they will take things which are very clearly a joke and treat them as serious, as if it was an official statement. And you could see a very triggered fragile king in, say, medieval times doing the same thing. Like, how am I funny to you? I'm like a clown? I make you laugh? Just sort of the same thing of treating the jester as if he's a regular member of the court, held to the same standards they are.
Yeah, well, I think that is a very interesting aspect of everything we're talking about. I think it has to do with, there's sort of a sort of sub aspect of why humor has an intrinsic relationship to the internet. I think it has to do with people, want to relax, go online, have fun, and then you share things. You naturally share things that are funny. Funny entails brevity in some way, so it's short. We can go. That's a whole other thing, but I think that's part of why porting all these powerful organizations and social codifications and ceremonies and everything, porting it over online, you bring it into that turf. And I think they know it's like a little bit of a dangerous thing. Humor is one of the only things really that can truly level any power differential. I mean, you can imagine, let's say I'm thinking of a powerful person like Jeff Bezos. If he walked out on the Amazon factory floor and some guy made a joke about him and everyone laughed, you've totally messed up the power differential there. And there's no way to switch it back. Well, there's no way for him to say that's not funny because everyone laughed. They knew it was funny.
Yeah, that's what Mark Twain says, against humor, nothing can stand. And I remember an interview with Alan Moore, the comic book creator, saying the same thing. He said if artists realized that they could brand anyone for all time, that they could make a joke about someone and it would become part of their reputation forever, they might carry themselves differently. I'm thinking again, of course, of people will make jokes about Napoleon syndrome or Napoleon being short, but he was actually a tall guy. And that was a rumor, that was a hit piece that was done on him during the time period in which he lived that was so effective. We still use his name as a synonym for being short and insecure about being short.
Yeah. And it's not even true, right? Was he actually short? Or maybe they don't know.
No, he wasn't. Yeah. Like, he was a man of average height for his time. Hold on. I'm actually going to look it up. Which is another thing. Like, literally, the height of Napoleon is going to be one click away. Hold on. He was 5'7", which actually... not
even like crazy short.
Yeah, for the time period, that was actually normal. Most people were not as tall as they were today.
Yeah, and I think that unleashing that power... It's not really unleashing. It's more like stepping into a domain where that is wired into the framework, and it's really just a possibility. I think that on some level, they know that it's really dangerous, honestly. I think that they know that. Let me put it this way. One thing that's a really interesting aspect of, ethnography and semiotics and all that sort of more academic stuff is that when human beings have ceremonies or spectacles or any sort of organized situation, things are actually set up very, very, very carefully to make sure that the people that are on the stage, let's say the stage in air quotes, don't get confused with the people who are there to watch. So there are some really interesting examples of that. Imagine a presidential inauguration, let's say. The audience is kind of part of it, but not really. There's set ways that they're supposed to react. They're supposed to cheer, they're supposed to clap, and if they start stepping outside of that, it gets a little weird. One of my favorite examples, as I mentioned, those semiotics guys and analyzing, ceremonies and things like that. This is one that really I never came back from, just this little tiny observation. He zoomed in on the royal wedding, of all things, and he said he went to the royal wedding and he noticed that if you're part of the official ceremony, you have a real Union Jack flag. You have a big cloth flag and you're holding it. But the audience members, they have tiny little plastic flags. If you think about it, there's really no reason for that. The people in the audience could have real flags if they wanted, but it needs to be that way so the audience members don't get confused with the people who are actually part of the quote unquote ceremony. So what I'm getting at is on the internet, that's all scrambled. It's totally scrambled. Who is the official people on the internet? If you have, and a presidential inauguration is a perfect example. What if someone quote tweets a photo of the presidential inauguration and gets 500,000 retweets on it? Well, then that person's kind of like the official person talking about it, kind of, right? It's all so scrambled and lateral that I think it's upsetting a lot of things.
So it sounds like the same way that the internet flattens place, it also flattens power and social status, such that someone who is an elected official is in the same space and side by side with someone who's just a celebrity, with someone who doesn't even have their real face but has a lot of followers because they post funny content, with someone who's a porn star, with someone who's just a regular guy, and they can all interact as equals in this space. And it's not clear who the performer is and who the audience is. They're all performers.
Yeah, and honestly, not only is it equal, the person that is actually lower on the hierarchy has an advantage, actually, because if you're 10,000 PhDs medical doctor and you prove lawnmower guy 57 wrong about an argument, I mean, that's basically to be expected. I hope you can do that, right? But if it's the other way, if lawnmower guy
Right.
57 proves the mega PhD wrong, I mean, dude, he's punching so far above his weight class that that's more interesting than whatever else was going on, right?
Yeah, maybe the reason that the current ruling class really cannot tolerate the jester is because he was always overpowered in the original court where there wasn't a clear hierarchy. And now that there's no hierarchy, he's way too overpowered.
Yeah, and I think also it has to do with what is funny and the fact that funny things, this is just my opinion, usually come from like weird individuals. I feel like, I don't know much about comedy writing, but I feel like in general, if you got a team of people together and said, okay, come up with something funny right now, it's usually not going to be as funny as some random off the cuff remark by some actually funny individual. And that also upsets the balance of power because, if you go on Twitter, honestly, I mean, pretty much every day, every other day, you can find something that is really just a genuinely funny statement from a random person. I don't know if like teams of writers bat that hard. I mean, I know they make really funny stuff, but just every hour, the collective hive mind can churn out something that is really just genuinely hilarious in a way that I think is difficult to fake.
Well, there have been studies done on how people come up with ideas. And most people, when they tell the story of how they came up with an idea, will tell a eureka moment. They'll say, and then this happened, and I came up with the idea. I suddenly realized this. And when you actually look at how people generate ideas, and even the stories that people tell, it's not a single moment. It's a slow process. And people are more likely to create ideas or further ideas through conversation. So I notice that when I do podcasts, when I talk to people, I have realizations about a topic that I wouldn't have if I was just reading something about it alone. And that even when I would do promotion for my own film, I would talk to someone about it on a podcast and they would ask a question. And that question would cause me to realize something and say something that I would later write down in a blog post as like an original idea that I came up with. But really it came because they asked a question and I wouldn't have thought to ask that question alone. And the comedy shows that are really good often have a writer's room, and they will get a bunch of people in a room and they'll talk to each other and they'll come up with something. And there is a collaborative element to it. And there's a way in which social media creates a giant writer's room where something will happen and everyone will start writing about it and pinging back and forth off of each other and create something that might be stranger or more powerful than if you gave the task to one guy and put him alone in a room and said, come up with a good take.
Yeah, wow. That's really interesting. I've used the term hive mind a lot, but I never really thought about the humor that I just described as the product of basically creating 1,000 monkeys in a giant writer's room that's bigger than any real writer's room you could create. That's really interesting. I think that is probably part of it. I guess I was imagining more like lone wolves, but now that I'm really thinking about it, it really is more of the hive minds, which I suppose function as a writer's room. I mean, I think that's part of why when memes take off, you can't really fake them, but they usually do come from weird little subculture worlds that I suppose do function like a writer's room.
And they come through iteration. 4chan, the place which many internet memes originate, is the most flattened. You don't even have a pseudonym on there. It is entirely anonymous. And so it's in some way the most equal a space. And it's also has the benefits of the internet and the challenges of the internet, because it's also the place where there's the least consequences for what people say. And there's a trade-off there in that there's the least consequences, but there's also the maximum benefit of anonymous collaboration. Whereas other platforms, it's very much that you post things to your audience. For example, YouTube, you create a piece of content and it's clear who is doing the performance and who is doing the audience. But even then, people will reply to each other on their social media. That was actually a shift in mindset that I had to have when I went from creating traditional media to creating stuff online, was that when you create a film, It's very clear. This is the film. You're the audience. This is my vision and what I'm wanting to show you. And on social media, you'll post something and someone will say something in the comments, and then like all the comments are talking about that one crazy comment you made. And it's like, I wanted you guys to focus on the art thing that I made. And even, you know, something like YouTube, someone will post a video that's very clearly something that they want people to respond a certain way. And then you'll get a million reaction videos that respond a completely different way.
Yeah, yeah, and that again gives like the jester an advantage because he's pitching from this like different mound. Yeah, the anonymous aspect of everything and the way it feeds back into, you know, commentary and sort of taking the reins from you know, like you said, you make a film and then everyone's talking about the reaction they have to the film. It almost becomes this like meta thing. The anonymous thing is interesting, and I really mourn the death, I guess I would say, not death, but the undergroundization of the anonymous internet, because like you were saying on 4chan, it's really the perfect example. There are no repercussions for saying this sword cuts both ways, because on the one hand, yeah, there's no negative repercussions, right? That's usually what we think of as repercussions or negative. So someone could say, you know, yeah, throw yourself off a bridge and they're not going to get in trouble, right? But there's also a lack of positive repercussions that impart a certain level of honesty that I think that the new internet is not really going to have. I mean, 4chan is a really good example on their, you know, finance board. Let's say if someone says, you know, I don't know if people are into crypto or whatever, but the point is, you know, you post your portfolio, you say, what do you guys think? If someone says, you're an idiot, sell X, get Y, or you're a fool, that person, I mean, they don't even have a name or an avatar or anything. They're just telling you that because they want to tell you. They're not trying to build a brand. They're not trying to, you know, there's no positive incentive either. So it's interesting because it kind of, like I said, goes both ways. I experienced that a lot with art, and I think that that has to do with the internet becoming safer and more tamed and what's the word I'm looking for? Domesticated would really be a good word. Because when I was like coming up in the game, when I posted art online and it was bad, people would say, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. You should never draw again. And if I saw this in real life, I'd probably throw up and never talk to you again. I literally can't believe how bad this is. And because of that, I was like, wow, I really need to get better. I really need to step it up. And I did. But I think that now, even with how mean people are online, the fact that it's not anonymous takes away that I have no reason to lie to you. I'm the only person in your life that's going to tell you you're going to show this drawing to 100 people in real life. They're going to say it's great because they're your friends. They're lying. This is really bad and you need to improve or stop. You know, it's almost becoming like it's difficult to tap into that truly anonymous honesty, I guess you could say.
One example of online honesty that I think everyone felt was positive was something like Post Secret. So there was a online site where people would send their secrets as an anonymous postcard, and they would show them in a very artistic way. And it was sort of a confession. It was a confessional. You would post like, I've never told anyone this, but, you know, people would say like, I really regret this, or I've always been in love with this person, or I miss someone who died. And you'd have people feel something and go, oh yeah, I've felt the same way. And I didn't know other people felt that. And so there's a way in which that anonymity gave people the ability to say things that they've always wanted to say or express without consequence. And yes. There's a lot of things I think that fit that category. And if anonymity goes, some of that might go too.
Yeah, dude, Post Secret is such a good example because I feel like, I don't know if they still do that, but that was really of its time. And even just talking about it, doesn't that have this irreducible charm to it? It has this irreducible, wow, I'm really getting just this window into this unfiltered communication from someone I'm never going to meet, never talk to, I'll never even know. I mean, charm is really a perfect word for it. It has this romantic nature to it in a way. It almost reminds me of, I used to be really into graffiti and stuff like that, which seems like a random segue, but in terms of graffiti stuff, there are guys who get really into it and then sort of wax poetic about, you know, the more meta aspects of it. And I remember I read this one thing. It might have been in a book called The Art of Getting Over by this guy named Stephen Powers. If that's his name, I don't remember. But he said something like, when you go into a bathroom and you look at the bathroom stall and someone's written something there, that is the only space in modern society where someone can communicate to you directly, totally unfiltered by anything, not filtered by who they are, what they look like, by any media, any advertisers, paper, nothing. It's just direct communication. And he was like, that's the only place. Graffiti is the only way for someone to directly talk to you unfiltered by anything. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think there's an aspect of the anonymous internet that also has that. Like, wow, this is almost one of the only ways where someone can directly talk to you unfiltered by anything.
It's also a universal human impulse that's been around since the beginning of civilization. So there's Roman graffiti in bathrooms that people have found that say things like, you know, Flavius was a whore, and, you know, this other Roman person is the strongest, and whatever sort of things people would write that are just exactly the same things you'd see nowadays. And I think that there might be something lost when that ceases to be a physical space that is separate from the rest of the world. Like, there's a reason people are writing that on the walls of bathroom stalls and not on the walls of office buildings. And now, I don't know where Post Secret is now, but I think that if you had first encountered Post Secret in your Twitter feed and someone had just posted those postcards as pictures and it was alongside everything else that people were posting, it would be a different experience than if you had to go to that website and read the latest update. And there was a different aesthetic and separation of that from the rest of the internet.
Yeah, dude, that's such a good observation. It would be completely and totally different. Even just the act of going to the website and it has the dark background and you're scrolling through this feed and that's the only thing there. I mean, it feels like going through someone's, drawer or something. It feels like a private experience.
That's one of the things I miss about the previous internet is that every place had a different aesthetic. I'm thinking too of, for example, the original Homestar Runner website. Like, that was a beautifully designed Flash website. And I don't know if you could do something like that now, because there's a way in which the platform determines the aesthetic. And one of the things that I struggle with is that I want often to get people into a different platform or space for that reason, because I'm aware that the platform changes the communication. That if you and I were to meet at a coffee shop and have a conversation, it would probably be a slightly different conversation than if we met at a noisy bar, or we went for a hike in the woods, or we were to have the conversation in a church foyer. Like, those are all different spaces that will actually change the conversation in some way. And what I notice is that when I try to get people to move mediums, sometimes they're like, why? Like, I don't understand. We can just talk. Like, I'm already on Facebook. Why would I go somewhere else? It's like, because it's somewhere else. Like, that's why you would go. It's going to be different.
Yeah, I mean, that is also another really interesting, weird aspect of tech. I mean, I totally 100% agree. I've actually thought about that. A little bit of a tangent, but it's interesting because, again, it folds back into everything else. I thought about creating another space, but then it's this weird thing where now I would almost be like responsible for what people say there. Like, if I registered, like, what is it called? Like a PHP forum or something. If someone came and posted, oh, I hate this group of people, let's go kill them. It's kind of like, it feels like I would be like responsible for that, or someone could at least paint it that way. So that's the other weird, insidious part of tech that I think started with analog tech. I don't know if it's an oxymoron, with physical actual devices, and then has hyper accelerated to 1,000,000 miles an hour with internet tech. Because once something is more convenient, the reality is that people do not resist it. They don't go and sit, like you were just saying, we can meet at the coffee shop. Why? A lot of people would do this, but it's just an example. Like, why hike up this mountain and go to the cabin if we can just sit at the coffee shop? Is kind of how it feels online. People would say, well, why would we go there? We're here already,
Yeah, I miss the format of old forums. And the reason I miss it was because I think it lended itself to more thoughtful conversation. And I really strongly feel that the format of old BBS forums was wildly superior to everything that we have now in social media for a couple reasons. First, it's self-selected for a group of people. So the forums that used to exist would usually exist around a topic or a subculture. And so you had the type of personality that would exist in that subculture. The same way that it used to be you'd go to a local gaming shop, and that was the place where you went if you were interested in video games. And it was a different space that you would go if you were interested in tabletop games or collectible card games. And so there was a niche store for every single hobby or place. There would be a hardware store, and you'd go there if you were really interested in building stuff for yourself. And that's how the internet originally began, is you'd have a website that was the guy who was really interested in your niche hobby. He set up a website, and there wasn't SEO yet. So people weren't setting up these sites because they knew that being the top search result for this niche hobby meant that they could collect all the affiliate money for it, or that their reviews for the products that they sold would come up first. It was just, there's a guy who's really interested in that, and that's what he was posting about. And then that guy would eventually, because people were contacting him, he'd start a forum. And the people that would go to that forum would be the same people that would exist in the physical space that existed before. But because it's a forum, people would end up talking about other stuff. So every forum that existed had an off-topic space, and the off-topic space was often the best place to hear conversations, right? Because you'd have a bunch of people. It's the same thing that happened in real space. Like if you went to a gaming shop and you started talking to people, like you'd have a conversation about what the best restaurant in town was, because you're all in the space already, and you get to start talking about other things. And actually you posted about this, that eventually online niche communities and forums become about the personalities there. And I was wondering if you could talk about that before. I'll get back to the other things about the superiority of internet forums, but I want to get on that topic before I move on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I do feel that way. I also definitely feel like the internet forums are superior. But yeah, what I was posting about was almost exactly what you just described, that when you congregate a group of people about a particular topic, it's funny because I think people that didn't experience it would probably think it's the opposite, that congregating people who are into guitars, that was the example I used actually, would just be a forum where people talk about guitars. But actually it has the total opposite effect, where once you've had all the basic conversations about guitars, what are the best strings, what are the best pedals, I want to sound like Weezer's second album, oh, turn your amp to 6 here and 4 here. Once everyone's had those conversations, you naturally start to talk about other things. It becomes about the personalities there. And then it takes on this meta aspect of being a community of people that all like guitars, but they're actually not there to talk about guitars, which oddly makes some of the most cohesive and interesting online communities, I think.
It's also because niche hobbies attract a certain personality. Like there's a stereotype of someone who plays Magic the Gathering, and there's a stereotype of someone who is really into video games, and there's a stereotype of someone who's always doing home improvement projects. And that type of personality usually has other aspects about how they see the world.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I experienced that with art too. You know, you meet someone and you say, oh, you're that archetype. You're that guy who makes that kind of paintings in that medium. Like, you're that guy. Nice. You know, so that, I think that carries over to other hobbies and stuff also, for sure.
As an aside, by the way, as someone who does film, one of the challenges I've had in the past is getting actors to play character types that are very different from theater nerds. Because the kind of person who's a theater kid growing up is very different than a character you might want them to play who is from those other subcultures. So like getting someone who's been a theater nerd their whole life to understand the psychology and character of someone, like we mentioned earlier, who's a nerd that lives alone in their basement. That's a character you might want to portray in a film, but it's just so different. And so there's a challenge there in getting someone into that different psychology. But the
well, that's interesting. That's really interesting, man. That's interesting because I feel like, again, it's like kind of an aside, but in art, I don't think I could ever do that. I don't think I could take someone and say, you know, oh, you're this kind of person, but I want you to make this kind of art. That's a really interesting parallel to acting, because that's almost inherently an aspect of acting, but of course it ties back into people's personalities.
It's one of the challenges too, I think, around media now, is that the type of person who becomes a journalist or becomes a filmmaker or becomes all of these different culture producing nodes is often very different than the audience. And this is something I remember having conversations with people around in film school, is that as film students, we were all interested in the weird art. We had seen hundreds of films, and so the films we gravitated to were ones that were different or wild in some way. But the average person is not always watching a film because they want to be challenged in some way or experience something totally new and different. And in fact, if you give them the same thing reliably in some way, that feels really good. Like, I watched a movie last night. It was very clearly inspired by Guardians of the Galaxy and like big pop sci-fi, and it was really good. But I, as a filmmaker who's seen hundreds of films, kind of knew what to expect and saw where it was going. Whereas if you put an artsier film on, or a film that's a little stranger or weirder, I wouldn't know what to expect. And that's an experience that's really fun for me. But for most audiences, they haven't like seen all that weird stuff, and so they kind of want the familiar.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting too in terms of all this, because with the internet, who are you catering to? Are you catering to the niche crew or the lowest common denominator or somewhere in between? I definitely experienced that with illustration, and that's part of why I call myself an illustrator as opposed to a painter or a graphic designer or something, because in the term illustration is the connotation that you're, if I was being uncharitable, I'd say you're making stuff that, like, well, no, it's not uncharitable. You're making stuff that normal people are going to enjoy. If you're an illustrator, illustration is different than, a 10 by 10 foot oil painting of Saturn eating his children. I don't think you really call that an illustration. Illustration has the connotation of Garfield or CD covers or magazine covers or things like that. So that's something I've wrestled with also, is subverting people's expectations and how you can do deeper things while also catering to the masses at large and sneaking things under the radar. Because again, on the internet, of course, like we've been saying, you're mostly reaching normal people who are just going about their day and happen to stumble across your stuff. At least that's my situation.
Well, that is a challenge that we were talking about earlier, is not knowing your audience online. Because for me, the art that I like and consume is often different than what I know my audience wants. And so there's always that question of like, how much to bring that in, and just how much to make about me and how much to make about the audience.
Yeah, for me, I have to imagine that I'm catering to quote unquote like normal people, but at the same time, I really refuse to compromise. It's funny you brought up Post Secret. I really want my stuff online to feel like something you found online that is weird and that is from some weird corner of the internet. I refuse to compromise on that. Maybe I take that and wrap it in a blanket that Trojan horses it into the normal world. But yeah, so it's interesting playing that dichotomy.
I feel the same way, that I'm always trying to hit both. I want to take this weird stuff that I like and make it accessible to someone who is not familiar with it.
Yeah, I think that's part of the artist aspect that I enjoy a lot. There is I don't know, initiatory sounds a little bit too like highfalutin. I'm not some like dark priest, like baptizing people in a cave or something. But I think there is that aspect of, let me show you something from a different angle. Put it that way. Let me show you something from a different perspective that maybe you hadn't thought of it this way before, or, something like that.
I want to circle back to the forum thing, because there's a second aspect of forums that I feel like really made them superior. And that was threading. So now, if you're on social media and someone posts something, it's there and gone. Like, if you refresh your feed, you will never see it again. Whereas with a forum, there would be a thread, and people had to stay on topic on the thread. And so the first post in the thread might be, I read this news article, I saw this thing, what do you guys think about that? And then the whole discussion would be about that thing. And very often there was a debate or topic, but that debate or topic would come in a very focused way, and people would quote tweet each other. Or not quote tweet, they would quote it, and then they would make a long reply. And so you get these threads where you'd have two people who had different perspectives, and they would break each other's statements down quote by quote and respond to it. And you'd have these long threads. And there was the advantage that you, as someone reading the thread, could see those two perspectives go off of each other and develop your own perspective on it. And then you could save it and come back to it later. And like, that was the thread on that topic. Whereas on social media, I don't see the same thing happening. I don't see the level of nuanced conversation. And ironically, podcasting is a place where that's kind of happening now. So like you and I are having a long discussion, talking to each other, and other people can listen and have the benefit of that discussion. But that discussion would be very different if we were replying to each other on Twitter or we were replying to each other on Facebook, and people wouldn't have the ability to go back and think about it the way that they would if it was on social media, because they would refresh the page and it's gone forever.
Yeah, and people still link to some of those threads. There are the legendary threads that like someone will link to and you can check it out. Yeah, well, it's interesting. On Twitter, no way. Definitely not. I'll give an example of like one like forum thing I'm thinking of, but on Twitter, definitely not. I mean, it's explicitly not designed for that. There's all these like little messy aspects of it, and of course it compresses what you're saying. But aside from that, which is obvious, I think there's also the presenting yourself as a certain type of person that clouds it. Like we were talking about before with the forum culture, eventually on the guitar forum, let's say, if some interesting topic comes up, here's one that actually happened that I'm actually thinking of right now. I was on this like punk music forum, and like we've been saying, eventually you've had all the conversations about punk music, so it's time to talk about other things. The subject of animal testing came up, and these two people happened to have totally different opinions on it. And I read this whole long exchange between these two people and had my mind opened about all these different topics. But I think it would be different on social media-ized internet if you saw two people having the exchange and one of them, their Twitter bio is, I'm the pro animal testing guy. And the other guy is like, well, I'm the anti-animal testing guy. And then you're kind of walking in like, okay, well, this isn't going to resolve in any meaningful way, obviously. I think also just touching on it, it's an interesting little like internet ethnography thing, but I recently started using Instagram more to post my art. Obviously, it's like, should be my native platform doing art and images. And someone came at me trying to like start an argument. They were like, why'd you draw X thing this way? Like, this looks so dumb. And they were totally wrong. So I wrote a reply and I was like, yeah, you're wrong. Like, about this particular factual thing, here's why. And I got in a little bit of back and forth with them. And I was looking at the Instagram comments where we're exchanging. And I thought, this feels really bad. Like this format, I feel emasculated cramming my thoughts into these like tiny little Instagram comments. And then I'm imagining people clicking like show 3 more comments. And I'm like writing these paragraphs down there. And I was like, this makes me feel like a kind of a loser, honestly, And I love arguing on the internet, but it's the format that crams you into this weird, like emasculated corner of someone's phone. So I think that's probably another just aesthetic aspect of it. On the forums, it feels good. Like you're saying, you can quote someone and it's a big paragraph and then you can see the writing below it. Yeah, I think that's definitely going away. It's sort of a similar thing on Facebook. If you get in a Facebook argument with someone, that already has this like negative connotation. And I think everyone knows that feeling. I haven't used Facebook in probably like 10 years now. But you open it and you see that someone's written like 4 paragraphs and there's part of your brain that says, oh my God, really? You just have like a negative reaction to it off the bat that you wouldn't have on a forum because that's why you're there.
Well, it's also why you're going to the space. So if you go to a forum, like it's literally called a forum from the Roman word for where we would have long discussions with each other. And just the image of the original Roman forum is a bunch of guys in togas pontificating towards each other. So already you're in a different space. Whereas Instagram, how would you feel if you showed someone a photo that you took and they wrote a paragraph below it? Or if you gave someone your yearbook and they wrote a long comment in it about how you suck. Like already you're not going to that space to do that. And it's similar to physical space. Like if you went to the forum to have a discussion and there was someone waiting there for you who'd responded to something, you'd be like, all right, like let's talk about it. Whereas if you went to the coffee shop to hang out and there was someone waiting at the coffee shop for you and says, the other week you said this and I just was really offended by that. You'd be like, go, just leave me alone. I'm here to get some coffee and hang out. Like, what are you doing? So it's a case where the spaces are not set up for that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's again funny because one thing about the whole, I guess if you wanted to call it internet studies and be a little bit more formal, is you just keep hitting these paradoxes. The forum and the talking and everything compared to all the other social media platforms is a perfect example of one of those little mini paradoxes, because you would think that moving people over to these platforms where the whole point is that you have a profile that fleshes out who you are as a person would make people's personalities more fleshed out, right? But it's actually the total opposite. I still remember people on forums that were posting stuff because over time you learn more about them. Oh, wow, this guy is actually pro animal testing. Oh, because his mom had this weird disease and it got cured by animal testing. Wow, that's so interesting. But on platforms where, like you're saying, it feels like a yearbook, it feels like a photo collage, there's an interesting paradox there where even though the platform is supposed to let you know more about the people, it almost does the opposite. It like facadizes everyone.
Well, it's because you don't have different spaces to show your personality. So I know that if I'm in a professional setting, there's a certain way that I'm supposed to behave. And in our real life, we frequently talk differently in different spaces. So if you're in bed with someone and you're lying next to each other, you're going to talk differently than you would if you were meeting them in a work environment, right? And if someone comes over to my house, I behave differently than if I meet them at a social gathering. Whereas because the internet is all one space, you're never really sure which space you're in. And so I noticed that on social media, if I post something about or related to the film that I've done or a book that I wrote, that it gets a lot of attention. And when I make offhanded comments about other things that interest me, it doesn't get the same attention. And that if I wanted to talk about those other things, I'd almost have to build a brand around them. Like I would have to go back to zero and think about what content I would post if I wanted to be known for that thing. Whereas people who know me in real life, they know me and I'm interested in multiple things. And if you were to come over to my house, you'd see like books on different topics and different things that I'm interested in, and eventually like get to know other aspects of my life. And so there's a weird way in which you almost need different spaces in order to showcase different aspects of your personality. Whereas if you're on stage all the time, then you're only going to see the stage persona.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Yeah, it's almost like if you started posting about, chess every day on Twitter, it would almost cloud your brand. I hate to say the word brand, honestly, but people would say, oh, he's a chess guy now, or maybe he always was a chess guy, and then it kind of feeds back into that's part of your movies, I guess. Is it or not really? I guess I got kind of lucky because it's again one of those double-edged swords, because for me, I think everything I do, I did a radio interview a while ago, and it was funny because, we kind of know each other. I feel like we know each other actually. Yeah. And the person that was interviewing me didn't know me at all. And they asked me, so, tell us about yourself, like who you are, what you do. And I realized that at the time, it was a while ago now, it was kind of difficult to encapsulate myself in a little brand soundbite, because I kind of ended up saying, I guess I'm like a weird guy on the internet who makes pictures, but you're a baby boomer. Do you even understand what that's a type of person that exists out there? So I thought about it a lot after that, and I thought, okay, I need to kind of pin it down a little bit more than that. And I think a lot of what I do has to do with thinking and the spiritual nature of life and things like that. So I get away with roping in pretty much any topic. Honestly, I could start posting about chess tomorrow. Probably wouldn't really throw people off too much. But it also has the double-edged sword of, I really hate to say this, but I will because we're really deep in the podcast. So anyone that's listened this far has given me the benefit of the doubt. But it almost puts me in the same class as, I hate that I'm saying this, as someone like a YouTuber who makes videos about their life. It almost puts me in that folder because I'm really talking about like my life in a way. So I don't know. There's no point, but I thought that was really interesting because, like you're saying, sometimes when you're online, I'm an oil painter, I'm posting about oil painting. If you started posting about tennis, it would cloud everything. And if you start to make it about you, then you've turned that observational camera on you rather than your art, rather than your films, rather than X, Y, and Z. It's just an interesting aspect of like the media itself.
There's two really interesting things that you said there. One is I feel like I know you too, and I've had this experience before where I will get to know someone online and we will have a depth of connection in some ways and be absolutely new to other things. And it's always a weird experience when you meet up with someone who you've known online, because it's almost a parasocial relationship that goes both ways. Like I have a relationship with who you are online, and you have a relationship with who I am online. But if we were to hang out at my house, like, we're totally new to that, but we feel like we know each other really well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The saying it as a parasocial relationship that goes both ways is an interesting way to describe it. Again, it's kind of like a paradox because a parasocial relationship is supposed to be only going one way,
Right.
but it actually does feel like the two ways thing. I was talking to someone recently, someone I feel like I'm relatively close with now online. You know, we're friends, and we were just talking about my post, and he said, "Yeah, that time that you moved, I remember you moved, and you made that thread about going to," and it was interesting because that's like a memory in his brain of me doing something like, remember that time when you moved, you know? And I thought, well, is that weird? You know, it's not weird. I put it online. I mean, of course it's not weird, but it has this interesting social feeling where it's almost like we hung out. It's almost like you were there when I moved, but of course you weren't. And then, you know, it's just really interesting in terms of knowing someone, the little details of their life and things like that.
Well, you mentioned the YouTuber thing. That was the second thing I was going to bring up, is that the vlogger experience is very much parasocial relationship as the performance, as content. In other words, if you see someone who's an artist or a celebrity, your first connection with them is usually their art. And then later you get curious, like, oh, who's this artist? You know, what's their deal? And you learn other things about them. And the interesting thing about social media or things like vlogging is that a lot of people really gravitate towards that parasocial aspect because they want to be friends with someone who's interesting. And there's almost an entire market of creators who've said, why don't I just sell the parasocial relationship with no art? Like, if they're here for that, then like, why bother with the whole, you know, getting good at acting or creating art or stuff that takes a lot of work when you can just monetize the whole parasocial. And in fact, that tends to be the thing that people come there for.
Yeah, no, that is one of the most, I don't want to say generation gap things, because I don't think it's a generation gap, but the Twitch streamers phenomenon is one of the things online that makes me feel like, okay, I'm a native to this space, but I don't really get this. When Twitch first came out, I was like, I remember I made a tweet that said, look, someone just needs to tell me, like, are you guys actually watching other people play video games, or like, what? Am I not getting it? Like, I don't get it. And I think it has to do with growing up online and existing in that space and having the parasocial relationship be a little bit more normalized to you that doesn't feel weird to them. Maybe you watch people stream games. I'm not judging, but it's interesting because for me, that dimension is not native or intuitive. Intuitive is really the word to me at all. I think it's also funny that like I just said, I was hesitating to even just use the word like YouTuber. I think it has that weird connotation because this is another interesting aspect of the internet. Pretty much, I'm not throwing any shade at them. I live online. I post my life online. I totally get it. But in general, the story of those people usually has some element of going kind of crazy as a social spectacle.
So you'd posted about that, and I wanted to ask you about that, about why it is, like, because we've talked about how the internet is kind of making people in power uncomfortable and go a little crazy. But how is it making just regular creators go crazy?
Well, such a good question. In terms of studying people and stuff like that, I was reading a book on religion the other night, and one phrase stuck out to me that I thought of here. I should really get their name. I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was William James in Variety of Religious Experience. It's kind of a seminal text about people's religious life. The person said that the extreme beliefs and the beliefs and people on the fringe can usually tell you something about the group as a whole and the more normal people in that group. That as someone looking at a case study, you can look at just, let's say, the fringe fundamentalist extreme version of something, and not that they're representative of the normal group, but they'll kind of tell you something about the more normal people in a way. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But on the internet, I definitely 100% think that's true. When you look at these people who, let's just say an extreme case, start live streaming their whole life and start putting every video of everything they ever do online, and they pretty much always will go a little crazy from doing that on the extreme end, I really do think that says something about the normal cases of people putting 50% of their life online, 60% of their life online. I have a few like specific things because I have thought about that a lot, mostly to avoid it in myself, to be totally honest with you.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, I think, well, one thing that I think is not really that noticed is the time frame and shifting social norms over that time frame. I guess that's the most mundane aspect of it, but I think that's a little bit underrated because, if you're a YouTuber and you've been making videos for 10 years or something, I mean, imagine what was normal and acceptable to joke about 10 years ago. And now it's this time period, all of that stuff, some of it maybe looks bad, let's say, and then it ties back into the everything's instantly available, there's no distance between anything. So if someone pulls up something you said in 2012, 2014, and it seems distasteful now, that little tiny number on the screen that says 2 or 4 instead of a 0 indicating the year, it doesn't mean anything. It's like you said it yesterday. And I think that a lot of people, this is another sort of aspect of the internet that I think is really interesting. For most people, I think that distinguishing between psychic and mental pain and physical pain, I think it's really almost like the same thing. You and I, probably everyone listening to this, has some level of self-reflection. Maybe that's even the common denominator of people who find us interesting. But a lot of normal people don't have that. And if they get 1,000 comments saying, you're a bad person, I hate you, this thing you did was horrible, and they're getting all this psychic and like spiritual damage, I think that imagining it as though it's physical, because that's how they're experiencing it, really explains a lot. Because most people don't have, I don't know if I should say ability, because that makes it sound like it's something you should have. It's more just like a feature, but they don't really have the feature of being able to look at 1,000 people and say, you all think this, but you're all wrong. All these people are wrong and I'm right and I didn't do anything wrong. And I think that over time or in specific instances, that just becomes too much, man. I mean, I think that's a lot to like handle.
I was literally watching an interview this morning with a YouTuber who'd experienced this. And she makes enough from her YouTube videos to employ several people who work for her. And when she was, quote unquote, canceled, she didn't actually, should I say the name? Or this is another weird space where I'm thinking like, this is a public figure, quote unquote, she has a huge YouTube channel, and yet I'm reluctant to single her out and start talking about her because it seems like a personal thing going on with her life. Like, this is what happened to her. And at the same time, I'm talking about an interview with her I saw on YouTube where she has a microphone and she's talking about it, right?
Yeah, so it feels like it's a public thing.
Yeah, it feels like, you know what it is? Because the internet creates this parasocial relationship, my norm around someone who I knew personally who went through something difficult would be not to share their name publicly. And if someone told me like, I went through this thing and it caused all this emotional pain for me, I might share that story to illustrate a point in what I'm doing, but I would change the details such that no one would know it's that person and just talk generally about what my audience could learn from this experience in which someone had experienced something painful and then overcame it. But I might do that differently if it was a public figure. And yet, because this, quote unquote public figure is one who's created a parasocial relationship, I'm reacting to them like I would a friend. Even though it's a YouTube video and they're giving a public interview and talking about it in that way. But the point of it is that even though this woman had not lost any money, was still getting the same amount of views on her videos, it was very clear that she'd experienced really deep emotional pain from being a trending topic on Twitter where people were, quote unquote, trying to cancel her for something that she said. It's like a pain of being misunderstood or feeling, it's hard to describe because you're talking about emotional hurt and you're talking about a relationship between her and thousands of people.
Yeah, yeah.
Past a certain point, you can't really conceptualize what that means. And so people will start reacting to their audience as if it's almost like one person. But you're right that like the emotional pain was very clearly felt in a very real way for her where I think most people who've been through that experience, if you said you could go through that again or get punched in the face, they would say, like, just punch. Like, just give it to me physically.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, they definitely would, for sure. We're biological creatures. I am pretty sure I've seen this recently, but you can just also intuit it logically. Isolation, and specifically the feeling of being rejected from the group, which in the past would have been a death sentence, right? Even up to probably even right now, if your community and group truly rejects you, you'll basically, wither out in the wilderness and die, right? So I think people experiencing that, it's not like their brain knows that it's X year AD. It's basically 50,000 BC in your brain. And when the group says, you're not part of the group, we're going to isolate you, you're bad, you experience it as though it's like a death sentence. I've noticed that it exists in different degrees in people. One of my favorite examples that I always think of is I was with my female cousin, and we were at this place. It's kind of like the DMV. And she had this weird specific situation. And she had to bring a form to this desk. It's kind of a long story. But the point is, we're sitting there. And I said, okay, go take the form to that desk. You're good to go. Let's do it. And she said, well, when I go there, the guy's going to think that I'm wrong. He's going to think that I shouldn't bring this form to this desk. I should bring it to another desk. And I said, but he's wrong. We're in the right place. We're good to go. And just the idea that someone was going to say, you're wrong, and look at her as though she was stupid, that was like a barrier she had to overcome. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that when people don't have that, you probably don't really have it too much. I don't have it at all. Porting that over to the internet, where, like we're saying, now you have 10,000 downvotes on this video. You're a trending topic on Twitter. Everyone's saying you're wrong and evil. How could they all be wrong? I think that contributes to a lot of the insanity over time, for sure.
Well, you almost have to build it as a muscle. So I, in some way, I think benefited from using accounts online that didn't have my real name and experiencing all of those things because there wasn't a consequence. In other words, if you have an account that's just like the me posting whatever dumb stuff amuses me account, and someone goes off on you in the comments and it's not your real account, you learn, okay, like there's not really a consequence to that. But the first time that someone ever came at me under my real name, I definitely felt it. And I was thankful that it was small and it didn't really affect me. And I got, okay, like I'm used to it. And then the first time someone ever writes a hit piece about you, like, okay, that's something new.
Oh, wow.
And like, that's a new experience. And now, if that happens, I kind of don't care. Like, I do feel like, if I was a huge trending topic online and everyone on a particular platform was talking about me, that would be new, but I've built up to it. And I think that it's really challenging for a lot of people because there's a joke that every day someone is the main character of Twitter and the goal is to never be that character.
Yeah,
and so if you've never had a public persona and suddenly you're the main character, you're on stage, everyone's looking at you, that's kind of a scary experience. And people, when they do this in real life, experience stage fright. Public speaking is one of the biggest fears people have, and it's because of that primal fear of rejection. And if you are suddenly on the main stage and you've never performed before, that's really scary. But I've done public speaking, I've done creating things online, I've done books and films. So at this point, if I'm on the main stage, that would be new, but not totally foreign.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done similar things like performing, stuff like that. I think also there's an aspect of it there where eventually one time you do actually really mess it up. And then when you don't, have a heart attack or die, you say, okay, well, I mess up. Who cares? Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I think that there's a deeper aspect also with, we talked about you do your films online. It's part of your online situation or the main aspect. I do my art online or it's part of the main aspect. There's something about that is solid and stable and that you can look at and feel confident about. If you make a movie and you watch the movie and you said, this is a good movie, and a bunch of people don't like it, you can still say, well, maybe they're wrong. I think this is a good movie. That happens with my art all the time. I make a drawing, I stand by it. Someone says it's bad, I say, that's just your opinion, whatever. I still can look at the art and say, you know what, at the end of the day, I did this and I'm proud of it, and that's something to be proud of. I think that when the content is yourself, that changes it a lot. Because if you make an oil painting and 100 people don't like it, you still made an oil painting. That's still pretty cool. And it's separate from you. It's an oil painting on the wall. But when your content is you, that's so subjective. I mean, if everyone doesn't like it, then they don't like it. And what are you standing on? It's just you, basically. And there's no wall between the content and yourself. And I think that also getting blurred over time contributes to the craziness of people that do that. And like we started with, that ports back over to people who are not putting 100% of themselves online, but putting 50% of themselves online, putting 25% of themselves online. That effect is just reduced, but I think it's still there.
I've made a very clear choice to keep certain aspects of my life separate from who I am online. And my basic rule is that I only post what I think is going to be beneficial or useful in some way to my audience. And I really only post about my own life once it would be weird not to. So when I knew that I was going to propose to the woman who is now my wife, I posted our relationship on Facebook and all those places. Because if I just posted the proposal and people who follow me or are friends with me online like didn't even know who this person was, I thought that would be a little weird. I should give them a little time to get used to the idea that I'm with this particular person. Mm-hmm. And of course now, we're having a child. I will probably have a kid by the time this podcast airs.
Oh, nice, dude. That's awesome.
Yeah. And so that would be weird if I didn't let people know. But like the details of what, having a family and that entire part of my life is like, I'm probably only going to share. Actually, I shouldn't say this because it might change, right? Like that's the other weird thing about the internet is, you mentioned this earlier, and the internet doesn't just flatten space, it also flattens time. And so everything is happening now. And there's a weird way, if it's not happening now, the internet actually does forget. Like I've shared things, posted things that the internet has forgotten. But if someone reshares them, it's happening now again. And so that video that you made 10 years ago, that comment that you made 10 years ago, it's like you made it right now if someone shares it right now. And it's a really weird experience because one of the strange things I notice is that there'll be a narrative about, especially, for example, around COVID, like what is happening right now. And it's different than the narrative that existed even a month ago. And unless you can have that narrative from a month ago and share it repeatedly on the timeline, there's this disorientation of like, where are we now? What is happening now? And people forget that those narratives change unless they're shared immediately.
Yeah, it's funny. People always say, the internet never forgets, but I was thinking about that just before we started recording. I was thinking that's actually not true at all. The internet
forgets all the time.
It almost is like the internet has a selective photographic memory, but otherwise it has hardcore amnesia. I mean, posting art online, I would love it if the internet never forgot. But actually, like you're saying, I post a bunch of art one week on Monday. By Saturday, it kind of feels like it never happened, honestly, which is in and of itself somewhat maddening. But yeah, there is like a selective amnesia aspect of it. We were talking about why people go insane online also, and I think that ties into everything that we're saying here also, because I think there's something about putting the lens on yourself and hooking yourself into that constant amnesia, but also it sort of relates to everything we've said so far, but constant need to keep being more out of the box and keep getting views and attention, which is in and of itself a very fickle, capricious thing. I think it kind of like warps your sense of self. And I guess that's one other big thing that we haven't hit yet, is that because so much of my, I guess I would say studies, that's really what it's been, has been about spirituality, that inherently entails looking at the self and what the self is, and different religions have completely different views about what the self is. And that's not just, is it real or is it an illusion? Maybe Buddhism says, well, it's not really real. Christianity says, no, you really do have a self. It's actually real. It's a lot more subtle than that, because it also entails, well, what is important? What is yourself? Like, is your job part of yourself? I mean, some people would say, yeah, for sure. Some people would say, well, not really. Some people would say, is this thing you did 10 years ago part of yourself? The self is such a fluid, weird thing to try and pin down specifics of, that when you start putting it online, that has a feedback loop. And now you're looking under the hood of the car and moving pieces around without even knowing it.
It's not just what is the self, but what is myself. And I wonder if the really intense emphasis that is rising now in politics and social theory around identity, around race and gender and sexual orientation and all of these things is in part because people are hyper-focusing on that question. And the internet causes people to focus on that in a way that they might not otherwise. You had a thread or a Twitter thread where you talked about how for normal people, being forced to be that self-reflective, to create content not about a subject or an art form or something like that, but about themselves, kind of drives them a little crazy. Like the image of the snake eating itself, Ouroboros.
Yeah. No, it definitely does. I mean, I don't know if most people know this, but the image people have of meditation in general, it's not in toto completely accurate. There is an aspect of deeper meditation that if you actually go and try and hook up with a guru or a school or something, they know it's a little dangerous. They know that even the most basic, let's say, quote unquote, basic meditational practice of like just sitting, if you're just going to take someone and sit them on a chair and say, here, do this for 3 hours a day. You can think or not, doesn't really matter. Just watch your brain, I guess. You can't let that happen unsupervised, because for some people, becoming that self-reflective that quickly, it'll mess up the whole, like I said, they're going under the hood, they're moving pipes around, they have no idea what they're doing. And that includes me too. That includes everyone. I'm not saying I'm some, person equipped to do it. But then when you have people taking selfies, posting them on Instagram, curating their meta self in this way, it definitely has a dangerous aspect to it for sure. I noticed that when I first got a phone with a camera and someone took a picture of me, and I had this memory burned in my brain. I'm holding the phone and I'm looking at this picture of me on the phone. And I was just thinking, wow, I really don't like this. I really don't like that I'm looking at this and being forced to say, that's me. That's me. That's me. Like this abstract, invisible spirit thing in my brain. That's it. That's me on the phone right there. And I really almost like tried to not do it again. I don't think I've taken like 1 or 2 selfies my whole life. Maybe one when I was in this, costume for this thing. It's not really important, but I generally don't do that. And I think that it warps people's brain over time to look at that little pixel screen and say, there I am. That's me.
Well, it sounds like with the internet, you're not only always on a stage all the time, but in front of a mirror all the time. And I remember there was a woman I knew who was dealing with a lot of body image issues. She wasn't happy with how she looked. She was feeling like she was a little overweight. And one of the pieces of advice that she got from a person that she was working with was to remove all the mirrors from her house. Because you don't realize how many mirrors there are in a home until you actually have to consciously remove them. Like there's one in every bathroom. There's often one in the closet or the bedroom. And when she wasn't looking at herself all the time, having self-reflective thoughts about her appearance and that inner monologue of like, her feeling like she was too fat or too ugly or something like that, then her self-image changed. And of course, when your self-image changes, then your energy changes, and her appearance actually changed a bit as a result of this. And it sounds like if you're in front of a mirror all the time, it's not just a mirror for your physical body, but for your psychic or intellectual self. And that is going to change certain things too. Yeah,
it constantly forces you to say, am I the kind of person that likes this? Am I the kind of person that likes this? I mean, even the most basic
what's my brand?
Dude. That's the perfect way. The fact that everyone has to think about what their brand is, that is, I mean, if you had a nuclear weapon to decimate the collective psyche of a population, it would be having everyone sit down and decide how they're going to curate their online brand. But now that's just a normal part of life that literally every person does.
Everyone has to be a media company.
Yeah, yeah. There's another, I don't know if I said this before, but there's another weird like paradox loop where every person online has to act like a company and all the companies are trying to act like people. So you have this weird inverted world situation. And the people, and it goes deeper too, because the people are held to the standards you would normally hold a company to. If a person says something, you don't say, well, that's just Tim, he works at the mechanic, whatever. You hold them to the standard you would hold, like Nestle to if they made an improper statement. But yeah, I mean, even the most basic token of social media engagement is a like, right? You have to sit there and think, am I the kind of person that likes this thing? It's weird. I mean, I used to be around a lot of media. Let's say it was like books or something, and I noticed that I had to kind of turn that switch off for people for them to genuinely engage with things. And it was pretty difficult because if you pick up a book and your first question is, am I the kind of person that likes this kind of book? Am I the kind of person that likes this book? And you read the whole book with that question in your mind. It's almost like you didn't even read the book because you were thinking the whole time, do I like this? Do I like this? Is this good? Do I like this? So you have to be able to turn that off to authentically engage with anything. And on the internet, that's never off. It's almost like the way that you're surfing around is via this network of things that you endorse or disendorse.
I feel the same way when I think about sharing something, because sometimes I'll read an incredible piece of content or see something a piece of art that I really love, and my impulse is to share it because it's really neat. But if I share it, then it takes on a new context as a thing that I shared, and maybe it's not what I want my particular brand online persona to be associated with. So if I find a really interesting breakdown of a political issue and I share that, well, now I've in some way taken a stance on that political issue. And if I find a really interesting commentary on sex and relationships and I share that, well, am I talking about my sex life on my professional media now? Because I shared this article that talked about a particular romantic situation. You get into all those questions. Whereas if I was talking to someone, and one person or a group of people in particular, I could evaluate, what situation am I in? Is this something they would be interested in too? And so that happens naturally even over the course of this conversation. We'll be talking, I'll say, oh, I saw this article the other day, or, I saw this thing, and it comes up naturally, whereas many of the pieces of art or things that have come up in this conversation are not things I would share on my social media or outside the context of this conversation.
Yeah, no, for sure. Or when you share it, you have to do the opposite maneuver and give like a qualifying statement of like, yeah, hey everyone, I'm sharing this article, but I'm not saying I endorse this conclusion. Right. I just think it's interesting, which is almost worse because then you're kind of saying this, you're kind of having to designate it as like nuclear, like, oh, this is a little bit, maybe you get uncomfortable, but it's not me, it's just this guy.
I did that once. I shared a piece and then wrote my sort of critique of it as to why I thought it was wrong. And then I had friends of mine share it unironically because it was done on the platform of Facebook. And so the article would sometimes show up in people's feeds without the commentary, and they would then share it without that piece of context that I added. That's another way in which the context really matters. And we were talking about meditation earlier. One thing that I wanted to mention about that was a critique that I saw of the mindfulness movement, which is a sort of attempt to take meditation out of the context of spirituality and just teach it as like a practice that can become better for your life. So we're not doing Zen Buddhism, we're doing mindfulness. And what this critique said was that that's actually really dangerous because the structure that exists in a spiritual tradition is there for a reason. And that if you do meditation a long time, there are challenges that might arise from that, mental challenges or problems or things that might come up. I mean, even in the original story of Buddha, right before he achieves enlightenment, Mara, this demonic entity, comes to him and shows him everything that he could show Buddha to get him to avoid enlightenment. It's sort of a last temptation of Christ type scenario where here are all the things you could have instead of enlightenment. Wouldn't you rather think about that than achieve enlightenment? And anyone who's done meditation knows that if you sit down and meditate, the first thing that happens is your monkey mind starts suggesting really exciting things you could think about other than meditation. It's like, here's this memory you haven't thought about for 10 years. Here's every pornographic scenario that you could imagine instead of this. Here's all your fears. Have you ever thought about how all these things could go wrong in your life? And you just have to be with those thoughts until they change. And that's part of the practice of meditation. And what this critique said is if you take meditation out of the spiritual framework, there's no safeguards for all of that. And people who are doing this mindfulness thing don't actually know how to handle it when someone has a breakthrough or has all these weird things come up during their meditation process. And it sounds like we have not figured out the framework for the internet yet. That we're putting everyone on a stage and we're putting everyone in front of a mirror and we're flattening hierarchy and flattening time and flattening space, but we don't actually know what framework makes that safe yet. And people who do acting, I took an acting class that went on for basically a full year-long program. And one of the things our teacher talked about was coming back to center. That if you go really deep into a character or a performance, you need to have a practice where you come back to center and you become yourself again instead of the character and ground yourself in some way. And we don't yet have practices like that in place for people who use the internet. So they're on stage all the time, never come back to center, never go from the public square to their own home. And they don't have any framework for reflecting on the self like you would have in meditation or a spiritual practice. And so all this stuff is happening and there's no way that people have figured out how to handle it yet.
Yeah, that's all definitely true. I've engaged with that quite a bit, just because it almost feels like my whole life, every field that I've been around has this tangential intersection with mindfulness. Like people are trying to bring the basket over and say, hey, guess what? We got this cool new thing. And I'm like, oh, no, we don't need that. We're just painting. We're just painting. We're really just doing paintings over here. We don't need that. I think that a really good parallel is one of my main critiques, I guess, of that, if I had to casually phrase it that way. It sounds really formal, but when you start telling someone to be mindful of these various different experiences that they're having, that's such a fuzzy metric to hit. Like, what does that even really mean? Am I mindful when I'm walking my dog? I guess, kind of. But it's kind of like you're throwing a wrench in the experience, because I made a comic about this actually where I'm walking my dog in the comic. But if you think back to most great experiences that you had, or really fun times, really beautiful times, they're usually characterized by actually a lack of meta awareness. Usually if you remember a really great time you had with a friend, you're not in his car thinking, oh boy, I'm having a really good time right now, and when we take this left turn, I'm going to make sure we have a really good time taking the left turn, and when we go hunting, I'm going to make sure I appreciate every moment of hunting. That kind of stops you from enjoying it, right?
You have to get into a flow state where you're just in the moment.
Exactly. So it's almost like you're throwing a wrench in people's machine, because you're telling them, it's funny, the acting thing. There's an acting exercise. I forget where I heard about this. Maybe it was some director who wrote some book or something. He'd say, okay, try really hard to make it look like you're sitting down in that chair. And it would be this painful thing of watching people like trying to make it look like they're sitting. And then he'd say, okay, now just sit down in the chair. And it looks perfectly normal and natural, obviously. And I think that sort of meta awareness often can jam things. And the internet is characterized by that. That's like the joke about people. They get an Instagram and then they have to, oh, should I take a photo of this? Should I take a photo of this? Should I post this photo? Oh, we're going on a walk in the park. I better make sure I take a photo of that, And I think that there's something about that meta awareness jamming the gears of a genuine experience that also is part of the whole internet thing. I mean, normal people shouldn't, like, we're having this conversation about, oh, I'm having a baby. Should I post about that? Well, I have this brand, I have this career, but normal people should not be forced to think about that for every aspect of their life for all of time. I mean, who asked for that? Who voted that policy in?
It's a very different experience than it is creating art and media, because when you create a piece of art, you're very conscious of what you're doing and that the character is separate from you. So if I write a story about a character it's not me, and everyone understands that it's not me. And in fact, I might make the character really different than me, or try to do something where there's multiple characters and it's very clear that none of them are like an author self-insert.
Yeah, it's funny. A really weird little detail about that. So I had this comic series. I still have it. I kind of paused it, I guess, called M99. It's about this guy who like works at this gas station. And it's like basically me. I mean, he has a dog, he has a wife. It looks like my wife, you know, it's like, it's basically me. But I made my avatar the guy from the comics. And it totally jammed up my whole operation. Like, it really jammed up my ability to post freely and to make the comics freely, because all of a sudden it got clouded, what you just said, where I was like, wait. I'm not the guy in the comics, though. And the guy in the comics isn't the one posting on Twitter. And I had to change it back. I had to change it. And it seems like such a small little weird detail because the guy basically looks like me. I mean, who cares? But that weird aspect of crossing the wires just messed everything up. I would sit down to make the comic and I'd say, well, is this Owen Cyclops in the comic, though? It's not, right? It's this other character, but am I playing the character on Twitter? Like, no, it's me, you know? And I think that you can imagine a normal person getting thrust into a weird meta labyrinth like that. I mean, it's kind of a lot to like unpack.
I've thought of creating social media accounts that are very clearly a character. So, yeah. I mean, even celebrities do this. So, for example, Stephen Colbert, there's like the Stephen Colbert Show account, and then he's got a separate account that's Stephen at Home, that's very clearly him not in the character. And you'll see people do this with brands. They'll create like a parody niche account. So for example, I'm thinking of like Drill on Twitter, or Wint, depending on what name you know him by. That's very clearly a character. The person who is making those posts is not as deranged as the posts themselves. And it's one of the challenges I've thought of with creating something like this is if I make it too close to me, then someone could dox the account and say, oh, this is what he really thinks. I found his secret account, and this is where he posts what he really thinks about things. And they would take it out of the context of a character or read things into the choice of the character that I didn't intend. In other words, if I make a character that could be me, or is close enough someone could do that reading, then they might do that reading and take it out of the context of a character.
Yeah, dude. I literally couldn't relate more to what you're saying, because I had crossed that bridge and pinned down my vibe on that as I progressed, because so much of what I do, like we touched on before, is operating in that space of, this guy's obviously joking, ... right? Is he? Like, it's a joke, but I can't tell. And initially when I first started posting, sometimes people would ask me, they would literally DM me and say, wait, are you like actually on this wavelength, or are you just kidding? Like, I really can't tell. And I had to cross that bridge, because as I tied my art into it and started talking more about serious things, like, you know, my experiences with, you know, drinking or whatever, it doesn't matter. People naturally felt a certain affinity towards me online, which I really appreciate and love. And then it started to feel like I didn't want to lie to them, nor did I want to totally collapse I want to use a really particular word here. I didn't want to collapse the medium between us. I didn't want to collapse it totally and say, you know, yeah, okay, like it's literally just me, like, you know, no more magic, like, you know, whatever. But I also didn't want to lie and say things that weren't true, you know? And that was really interesting to navigate. I ultimately kind of landed in a space of, it's all real and I really feel that way, but I am joking around sometimes and I use the jester thing. But it's interesting because I can't lie anymore. Not that I never lied, but joking sometimes has an element of saying things that are untrue. And that gets a little fuzzy and weird. You know what I mean? Like, here's a perfect example. This happened like a month or two ago. I was sitting at my desk and I work at my computer all the time. And I just thought, I have this shirt where it's like a saint woman cutting the head off an alien. And I had been thinking...
I have that as a print.
Oh, nice, dude. Awesome. Yeah, I love that one. That's like pretty quintessentially me in a way. I'm glad you have that one. So anyway, I was sitting there and I love thinking of pranks on the internet and things like that. And I thought, you know, whenever anything gets posted that's even remotely interesting to that Reddit relationship advice forum, everyone on the internet sees it, it feels like. If there's a funny, interesting post there and it gets up there, it gets reposted everywhere. And I thought, you know, it'd be really funny if I made an account and I just posted that, you know, let's say I pretended my boyfriend got this shirt of a woman cutting the head off an alien, but my dad really loves aliens and they were fighting about it. I was like, that's really funny. And I'll post it, and then maybe people will find my shirt. That sounds like a really funny thing to do. So I did it. I literally didn't think much of it at all. And I did my whole work day, and I came back, and it was like on the front page of the Reddit relationships subreddit. So I was like, wow, that's really funny. I was like, that's hilarious. This is so funny. And it got posted to Twitter, and I was like, wow, this is really, really epic. Like, I can't believe that's so funny. But then the thing is that I had people DMing me being like, oh, I saw this, and I didn't want to lie to them. And I also didn't want to make them feel foolish. I didn't want to be like, dude, it's just a joke. Like, I wrote that, obviously, and then have them feel stupid for thinking it was real. So I quietly deleted it, and I was like, oh, I didn't really think it would go that far. And it wasn't a big deal, but it's just an interesting example of everything we're talking about in terms of, well, I mean, did I lie? I guess it was a lie, but it's just a joke on the internet, right? But at the same time, then when someone who's close to me, like if you DM'd me and you were like, oh, dude, this is so epic, like this girl's boyfriend, I would feel bad. I'd be like, oh, dude, it's just a joke, like it's not real. And it kind of is a really interesting note to hit that ties everything we've been talking about together, where it's just the internet, like I'm just joking, but technically it's kind of a lie, but shouldn't you be skeptical of things online anyway? But are we past that time now? It's really interesting, actually. I thought about that little specific example a lot.
Hold on.
And I don't do stuff like that anymore.
I find the story you just told fascinating because I saw that Reddit post.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it was you. And I thought,
okay, yeah.
That's good for him. Like, he's getting the art out there. But I didn't realize that was a piece of marketing. And I think this is another aspect of the internet that's really important, is that you never know what's authentic and what's actually a piece of marketing or a psyop or created. You use the term on a Twitter thread, dark internet magicians or dark.
Yeah.
What was the exact phrase? Do you remember?
Maybe dark internet magicians, maybe. Because magic
something
has a whole
like
tie
that.
with language and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, because the stuff that is done as marketing or a psyop will often try to feel authentic, but real people feel like they need to be professional or create something that is good brand content. So you have the people trying to act like you said, like companies, and the companies trying to act like people. And one of the things your story reminds me of is when I lived in Los Angeles, my housemates worked at a major advertising company. Uh-huh. And they did like branded spots, those commercials where you pay a large chunk of money and get a celebrity and air them all over TV. Like, you've probably seen my old housemates work. But when they had this celebrity come out for a piece that they did, while they shot it, they also shot a bunch of social media content. And the social media content was the celebrity hanging out doing stuff, and the product was in the shot, right? So the celebrity just happens to be hanging out with their product in this viral video. And this was 10 years ago. So I don't even know what the laws around disclosure were for that you probably didn't need to show it as a sponsored post. And they did a video where this celebrity did a physical trick. I think that they kicked a soccer ball across hundreds of feet and landed it exactly in the trash can. And in the real video, because I was their housemate, I saw it, the celebrity did not make it because it was really, really far, and basically no human being could do that. In the video that went online, the celebrity made it. And my aunt shared the video with the caption, "Wow, I didn't know humans could do this." I knew, I'd seen the real video, this was not authentic at all. The celebrity, while they were hanging out, just happened to be holding a certain branded product and set it down really close to the camera to then, do this particular trick. And the voice in the original was one of the guys who worked at the advertising company, and they had to loop the voice because SAG actor rules were such that you had to have a member of the actors union doing the voice. So they looped the voice. It's actually sounded way worse. I thought the guy who worked at a marketing company was way more authentic than the actor they ended up getting. But that's another really weird example where you don't know what content on the internet is fabricated. And I am certain that there are posts on those Reddit forums like, "Am I the asshole?" or Reddit/relationships or Twitter posts or things like that are a performance.
Oh, for sure.
And someone doing something for a reason, but you don't know. And that's also a really weird place, is not knowing who else is a real person and who else is actually on stage.
Yeah. So that's really funny that you saw that, because like I said, I was thinking like, oh man, I don't want to like deceive people. And it's interesting because you mentioned like the dark magicians thing. And like, I really thought about it a lot, because part of what I love about the internet is that, you can put on a mask and do this weird thing and people don't know, and it's funny. And I like that prank. For me, it's like prank. I like the prank, weird, again, gestury aspect of it.
I do too. I like it as a performance aspect.
Yeah, exactly. But then I started thinking, I feel like I don't want to like you said, your whatever aunt or grandmother, I forget what it was, saw that and said, wow, I didn't know humans could do that. I thought, I don't want to like be warping other people's reality without their consent. And that's kind of where I landed on why I felt weird about that, because I'm sitting at my desk and I deleted the post. And then I thought, why do I feel weird about this? I mean, that's funny and like, it's not a big deal. And like, it literally couldn't hurt anyone. Like, why would I care about this? But I felt kind of bad about it. And that's kind of where I landed. I thought, if people come to my tweets and they're looking at my Twitter or maybe a piece of art I made and they're not sure what's going on, it feels different than warping their reality without their consent. And I think that that's where brands, I think everyone would agree that's where brands kind of step over the line. So yeah, that was just a really interesting case study, because I had to sort of push that gestury prank energy into other more sophisticated forms, even though there's the low-hanging fruit of, honestly, I don't know why more people don't do that. You could basically get a free advertising on those forums so easily. Maybe they do and we just don't realize it.
I'm certain that many of them do. I mean, I remember reading analysis of, like, it was a forum, it might have been Reddit, it might have been a different place, of posts about paranormal events. They went through and analyzed this forum, and they said 90 to 80% or whatever percent of them could be explained with natural stuff. I mean, you looked at actually when someone said, oh, was this a paranormal event? Like, you could find an explanation that, probably showed that it wasn't. And then they said there's a certain percentage of them that they really couldn't explain. And they said, but it's possible people just made those up. And you would say, well, who would go on, a forum and make something up like that? They said, well, would you believe that 1% to 2% of posts on the internet are fake and made up? It's like, yeah, actually, I could see that like 1 out of every 100 people on the internet just make something up that isn't real. And they're like, great, like that's the percentage of posts on this forum that we couldn't explain or find a scientific explanation for. And you say like, well, they're all fake and made up. Like, well, that can't be true. But percentage-wise, it kind of makes sense. And if you think about the fact that people who are making things up on the internet, especially if they're doing it for purposes of marketing or social influence, are crafting it intentionally so that it will be seen by a lot of people and trigger certain emotional buttons. Like, of course, the percentage that rises to the top, which is crafted consciously to rise to the top, is going to have a greater percentage of stuff that's fake or has an agenda in some way.
Yeah, and people do, it's interesting, again, porting it back over to like the spirituality realm, like, those people who would say, well, I don't know, all these stories can't be made up. Whenever I hear anything like that, it really reminds me, I don't know if you know about something called, I think it's called breatharianism or breatharianism.
Yes, I've heard of that.
In case other people don't know, it's this weird, like, new agey spiritual thing, I guess you could say, although it has older roots, where people say, you can not eat, not drink water, and you can just get all the nutrients you need from breathing air and sunlight. And there are people who have actually tried that to a dangerous extent. They've said, okay, I'm doing it. And I watched an interview with one of these women, and it wasn't even an interview, actually. It was one of her like diaries or something. And she said exactly that. She said, I just can't believe that all the people that have said that they've done this are lying. So I'm going to go for it. And I think she almost like really hurt herself, So it's just interesting because I think that also colors, the social media telling, tales online and stuff. It's just an interesting realm. And it feels so different than 5 years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago. I feel like I never would have felt that way. In fact, I would have almost enjoyed that aspect of the internet the most. Someone tricking someone else, someone doing X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's the advertising thing. Maybe it's the money thing too. I think that kind of makes it weird. Like if you just pull a prank on someone and it's just a prank, that's funny. But if you're like making money off of it, that feels kind of shady, right?
Yeah, there's a different element to it then. Because the motivation for a prank is humor and it's entertainment and it's getting everyone to laugh. Sometimes it's mean-spirited and it's laughing at someone else's expense, but it's still just laughter. Whereas if there's money involved, it's no longer a prank, it's a scam. You're not motivated by laughter, the person's motivated by money or some other element of gain or social power. And it reminds me that, we were talking about earlier how people used to say the internet is not real life. And with that came the saying, don't believe everything you read on the internet. And now we've talked about how the internet is a mirror and it's a stage, but it's also a screen and something through which you're experiencing and learning about other people. And now there's a big push on the internet to remove misinformation. The idea that instead of just telling everyone the internet's fake, don't believe everything you read on the internet, what we have to do is figure out how to make it so that people who cannot distinguish between what's real and fake on the internet don't have to. And part of that is because it's way more sophisticated. Like the influence operations that occur on the internet are way more sophisticated. And this is something I struggle with because every now and then I will see people get upset about things in a community I'm involved in or a movement. They'll say people in your community or movement are posting things which are offensive. And I'll think, I've never seen that at any real life event for people in that community or movement. I wonder how many of the things that people are attributing to the movement or community that I'm a part of exist only online and may not even be posted by people actually involved in that group. Like it would be very easy for me to create a social media account that is claiming to be a part of a community or movement that I'm not a part of and that I actually don't like and want to make look bad, and then to post the most vile things that I could from that account, and then people would think, oh, people from that group are just really bad. And there's been documented influence operations done by political organizations to do just that, to frame other groups as toxic in some way by creating fake accounts for that group. Now, not only do we have the problem that the internet is not real, but you can't believe everything you read on the internet. And because now people are saying the internet is real, we don't actually know how to distinguish between what we should believe and what is real on that platform and what isn't.
I literally couldn't agree more. And also, without the skepticism, it's impossible. It's almost the worst part of porting everything from real life over to the internet, because what you just described, isn't that like the first thing that anyone would think of if they were trying to discredit someone else? I mean, literally the first thing you would think of is, oh, I'll make an account that says, I'm Owen's biggest fan, and be like, oh, I hate these kinds of people or something. It's like the most dumb psyop you could ever think of. And yet there's no resistance to it, because if you show anyone something, they'll just take it at face value, almost no matter what.
The other aspect of that psyop is that then people will come to you and ask, why haven't you disavowed the people in your community who act this way? And it's like, because I don't want to give them a platform. Because if I talk about them from my real face and my real account, now they're more real.
And you validate it, and then the psyop was successful.
Right.
There's also this weird thing that I talk to people about sometimes in real life. Like I'll just use like the numbers on them, because a big like sub part of what I do is this is like a pretty lofty aim, but I feel like just raising the level of meta awareness in people is going to be really helpful moving forward. So I do think about, how can I talk to people about this? How can I pitch this? And like I've had this conversation with people offline where they'll say, well, I saw these crazy comments, all these people say X, Y, and Z online, they're totally real. And you can kind of even break it down, even if you accept them as real. How many people live in the US? Let's say it's just like 300 million. So I hope I don't mess up the numbers here. So what 10% is 30 million, 1% is 3 million, 0.1% is 300,000, and 0.01% is 30,000. So even if you get rid of all the bad ideas in society, if it's even only 0.01% of people, that's still going to be 30,000 people that you can always find online. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, where there's no distance between anything. I feel like in real life, I kind of try and like shake people up sometimes. And I say, we have to like push past this, because there's always going to be those 30,000 people who think any crazy, wild thing you can think of. And we have to be able to go past it. Otherwise, we're kind of at like a jam in society because of that, whether they're real or if they're not. Like we're saying, it's probably really a mix of both.
The other challenge is that those people can all find each other and form their own community. So whereas before you'd have a couple bad or crazy people in each town, 30,000 people is an audience.
It's a lot of people.
Is a movement, is a convention. Like if you had 30,000 people who were all interested in one crazy thing and would buy a product on it, then you have an audience. And then the moment you're selling to 30,000 people, well, there's an incentive then to market that further. And so I think that's part of the reason that you see a lot of weird or niche conspiratorial movements forming now or becoming popular, because those people can find each other now and can create it. And in some ways that's great, because there's all sorts of other cool connections that are happening because people can find each other. And if you try to shut down the connections, well, I mean, isn't the whole point of this to connect to each other further, to become more connected?
It seems like that was the point, yeah. I mean, I like using that example because I feel like 0.01% of any population is a good metric for probably any idea could land on 0.01% of the population, regardless of what it is, right? It kind of feels like going beyond that is taking it into like an infinitesimal place.
It's also like if you have an audience of 100,000 people, what are the odds that in 100,000 people, just even if you were to select randomly 100,000 people, that 1% of them have an emotional or mental or social issue of some kind? Well, 1% of that many people is 1,000 people. And so now you have 1,000 people who are going off or have, emotional, mental problems of some kind. And that feels really big, especially if some of them are really prolific posters. So if you have an audience of 100,000 people, if someone in that group is unstable or mentally ill or something like that, they're probably going to spend a lot more time going off and doing unproductive things. Whereas the people who are mentally stable, who are connected to others, emotionally healthy, aren't as likely to be spending all their time going off on a particular topic online. And of course, it's probably a higher percentage than that, especially when you start looking at subcultures and groups that are involved in a weird idea of some kind.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that that's part of why we sort of started the whole conversation with, what are the ramifications of porting the internet, the real life online. And for me, a huge part of that is if I had to make like a thesis statement or something, the lack of clear rules causes a ton of damage because of the ambiguity. The lack of, like we're just saying, am I responsible for the people that follow me on Twitter? Because if they are, I'll play by those rules. If those are the rules, and I'll block people. If I'm not, I'll play by those rules too. But the problem is, I have no idea. Does anybody know? Am I responsible for people in my YouTube comments? I mean, they may be. It kind of feels like no. What about my live show? When I'm doing the painting show, am I responsible for people talking there? I mean, I can see what they're saying, but I don't know who they are. And I think that if there were just rules codified, it would prevent a lot of like collateral damage. But then you sort of step into this other space where I think in some ways it's a little bit intentional. Weird parallel, but I go into all different religious topics and stuff, but within Catholicism, you have these declarative statements. You have these statements, it's right on paper. You can always go and read what the dogmas are. But what some people talk about is something called weaponized ambiguity. And that sometimes, someone could write a statement, just theoretically, someone could write a statement that is intentionally ambiguous. So they have the wiggle room to act laterally, and step outside the bounds of what the statement would normally say. And I feel like that is part of the space that we're playing in online. It's not like a hard totalitarian system where there's 10 rules on the wall, and if you break one, you're going to get dragged out to the gulag. It's more like no one knows what the rules are, which is actually kind of worse.
I see that especially in the moderation policies of platforms, where they're like, the rules are that you can't post any hateful content. And it's like, okay, like, what do you mean by that? If I say like, I hate ice cream, is that hateful content? Like what, or you can't post misinformation. And it's like, according to whom? That's actually a really vague rule. And in some ways, this is something that the old forums had easier, because build your own was something that was way easier to do when you were dealing with forums and when you were dealing with niche communities or things like that, because people would do that. They would get banned from a forum and they'd start their own forum. And that was actually a really common thing, but you can't really start your own hegemonic platform. That's actually really, really difficult to do.
No, it's impossible.
And you were talking about the rules being clear. So some of the rules are very clearly written with big brands and creators in mind. One of the things I've heard is that regulation is actually really difficult, because big companies, it's a lot easier for them to follow regulations because they can just hire someone whose job it is to make sure they have compliance with the regulations. Whereas a small company might not be able to afford that. The owner will be doing their product or art and also trying to figure out the regulations. And so I had that happen when the trailer for my film went viral. I had a Facebook page for the film, which I was just starting out, and it had like 200 likes. And I went from that to several thousand in the span of 3 days. And there were lots of comments because the trailer was being shared everywhere, which is great. That's what you want, right? You make a film, The trailer comes out, it goes viral. Good. But I had someone getting mad at me like, oh, why are you letting all these like mean, comments on your page? And it's like, because I'm not a professional moderator. I'm a filmmaker. If you have a problem with something posted on Facebook, you should take it up with Facebook. This is not my platform and not my job to moderate. I don't have a moderation team. Whereas if you are running a big brand, you probably do have a moderation team. You have someone who's your social media person whose job it is to figure that out. Whereas an average person, now not only are they performer and they're in front of the mirror, but they're also expected to be a moderation team. That's a weird job that even big companies have not figured out yet.
Yeah, and again, the double-edged sword is just the ultimate metaphor for all this stuff. Isn't it kind of the opposite of how they're making it sound? Because if you have a Facebook page and you just say, look, I don't delete comments, I can't even do this, I'm too busy, then clearly you're not responsible for anything. But if you start going in and curating the comments, then it flips and now you are kind of responsible for everything. Then the implication becomes, oh, well, he left this up, so he must not have pruned it because I know he prunes the comments, So it's this weird, like, again, double-edged sword. I do just want to say one of my most painful observations is that they slipped this one in. This is why it's interesting to get into like semiotics and analyzing things. They really slipped this under the radar, but I just got to point it out. They switched the term from disinformation to misinformation, which I find very dystopian because I deal in like sometimes like conspiratorial things. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I'm a normal guy, of course, but I love looking at weird stuff. And I noticed that because disinformation is something that's not true. That's objective. If I say there's a big spider in the room and there's not, that's disinformation. But misinformation gives you the cover of saying, well, technically this is true, but it's not characterizing this situation properly. And I think that was intentional, and it gives them the laterality to say what I just said. You can say, hey, there were 35 murders in my town last year. And someone can come along and say, well, that's misinformation. It's technically true, but you neglected to mention that 100,000 people moved here last year. So it's misinformation and we're taking this off the radar. I think that that's a really, if I could like fight for something in terms of the social discourse, which I can't, it would be that, because that's a really like not clear distinction.
That's a smart observation, because I've seen fact checks on social media websites that say it's true, but proper context wasn't given. But like the fact check says, official fact checkers have found this to be misinformation. That doesn't have the context that it's actually true. And the context that they think the statement should appear in is a subjective, artistic, or like that's a decision. What is the correct context of a thing?
Yeah, I think I maybe noticed that. It's funny, like as we're talking about this, it's like all the things you're into kind of blend together. I think that maybe I noticed that specifically because I listen to so many debates about the Bible and scripture and things like that. And that happens all the time in those debates. Someone will say, well, look, point blank right here, Hebrews 3:11 says X, Y, Z. And the other person, even if they're right or wrong, can always appeal to, well, it does say that, but the larger context is. So I think I'm like very sensitive to like someone saying, well, yeah, true technically, but in my subjective view, actually, it's not true. And that's a really weird like space to operate in. One other thing that like kind of perfectly ties into that, and I feel like I've never really seen anyone discuss this anywhere. Maybe I'm just not hooked into like the discourse anymore, but one thing that I feel like we also should have a larger like conversation about socially is like, I'm very into like how logic and debate and people's verbal programming and what they say and if it's like logical or not and what they're like programmed to say, frankly. And I feel like the thing it always comes back to is what we're dancing around. Maybe I'm dancing around it with like, free speech, platforming or not platforming stuff, is people always appeal to like, well, it's a private company, you're on their platform. So, that's it basically. But I think that somewhere along the line that changed because now companies can ban you for things that you do in real life. Like if I went tomorrow to some, super mega violent rally and I was the leader and I said, let's hurt people, I could get banned from Twitter for that for sure, even if I didn't do anything on Twitter, right? And that sounds logical. You're like, well, yeah, if you're doing crazy stuff, yeah. But the implication of that is insane because it means that if you want to use these platforms, you have to live your entire life all the time under their terms of use policy. Like what? Like if I'm at a party, let's say I said something crazy and someone recorded it and I have a Facebook page and that's how I run my business, my Facebook page could get taken down. So now, but that sounds logical if you paint a crazy picture, but that means that when I'm at parties now, I have to think about, if I'm going to get banned from Facebook for like saying something in real life. Like it's a crazy example of the real life becoming subservient to the internet that I think most people haven't unpacked yet because they're still in the stage of, well, when people get banned, they kind of deserved it, whatever, who cares?
Man, you're bringing something up because I've had that happen. I've had someone get really upset with me for something that I said in a conversation with them. And not even what I actually said, what their interpretation of what I said was, right? Mm-hmm. And then try to take that online to spaces where I'm doing professional things and like have the fight there. And anytime someone does that, it used to be that if you wanted to get rid of a political opponent, you had to hire an assassin and the assassin would go and kill them, right? And now, of course, that's illegal. So people will engage in character assassination, right? They'll try to not get rid of the person, but the digital presence of them. And anytime someone does that, man, I treat it like they came at me with a knife and respond accordingly. But that is that's another weird element where the context of a conversation is different than the context of a public statement on the internet. I don't know if I have a question or thought around that. It reminded me.
No, yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, again, like you hit that little idea in like so many different subfields. Like I recently started researching a bunch of like art forgery stuff because it dovetails a lot of things that I'm interested in. And there was this really funny example where I think it was a Rothko painting. Someone forged a Rothko painting and the gallery said it was real and they had to defend it and they brought in all these people. And what's funny is that the gallery said, well, look, these 10 people all acted like this painting was real. And what the people said was like, whoa, we were at a party and you asked me about the painting and I said it looks great. That's not the same thing as me making an official statement that I think that it's real. And it's funny because the documentarian, I don't know if they intentionally, but it kind of made it seem like it was somewhat absurd. But that's totally legit. I mean, if you talk to someone at a cafe or at a party and I say, yeah, I would love to do that, that's totally different than putting it written down in blood in a contract. I would love to do that. And the internet obscures all of that. In one of my threads, I made an example of, if someone's on stage at a comedy club and they said, I'm going to go home and beat my dog with a stick, you might laugh, you might not laugh, but you're not going to leave thinking like, oh my God, that guy's really going to go beat his dog with a stick, But if someone was at my house and told me that, maybe I would think that. And the internet just blurs all of that context and makes it basically whatever you want.
It's really bad for intimacy because intimacy requires the context or safety or container to say things which are risky or might be taken the wrong way. And usually when you're getting to know someone, there are things you might talk about or conversations you might have that you're not going to have on the first time you meet them. But if you know someone a long time, you probably will have that conversation. that doesn't seem possible in the context of the internet.
Yeah, because it's all public statements. You are saying it in front of people, and it does feel like you're, signing your name in blood at the bottom of the big piece of parchment. There was even another funny example, like you said, I don't know if I should name him or not, but this guy that had webcomics that like really popped off for a minute, someone dug up, I think it was like a Facebook post he made like years ago. I don't know how old it was, doesn't matter, but the Facebook post was like, I have this person in my life. She's like a really great friend, and her mom almost got an abortion, and I'm really glad that she didn't, because now I have this great friend in my life, like hashtag like National Life Day or whatever. And people took it as like, oh, so you're using your platform to say that abortion should be illegal and women should be put back in the alleys. And it's so funny. It's just a funny example because it's like, dude, he's just saying he's glad his friend like exists. And you're taking it into this like political arena of like, as though he's on a podium in front of like 30,000 people,
It's context. I've had the same thing happen. I've like posted something to my friends on Facebook and had haters screenshot it and write an article about it. And
that's insane.
The comment was, it was really early. It was like February 2020 when COVID was just becoming a thing. And what I told my friends was, you probably won't get it, but the disruption of the economy that happens might affect you and you should prepare for that. Which, by the way, totally right on that prediction. And the person said, like, how can you say that? You're trivializing the deaths. Like thousands of people have died because of COVID. And it's like, yeah, but my friends are really healthy. They tend to be younger. And I don't know. I know 2 people in real life who tested positive for it. And they described having like mild headache symptoms. And that was it. So my friend group, this is true. Like, they're not likely to get it. They're not people who are in the at-risk demographics. Their lifestyle is such that they're not regularly exposed to situations where they might get it. But taken out of that context, it's like, well, no one's going to get it. And that becomes the statement.
Yeah, no, honestly, that's so true. And it ties back to like the different kinds of like totalitarianism that I talked about before. I think I got this metaphor from a girl named Soph who makes videos online, and I totally adopted it in part of my worldview. I took it on like 100%. There's different like kinds of totalitarianism, and there's male and female. And the male one is like, you said there's no dogs in this town. There are. That's a lie. We're going to throw you in the pit now. But there's also the female kind where it's exactly what you just said, where technically what you just said is 100% factually correct, but you're going to get in trouble because of the implication and how you said it. And I really like that metaphor because everyone's been dating someone, whether it's a man or a woman. And eventually you have an argument where it's like, yeah, look, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And right. In a relationship, that's totally valid because you're building this emotional bond over time. But you don't really want your society to be engaging with you on those terms of now the mob is going to come for you. Even though you didn't technically do anything wrong, it's the enthusiasm or the implication or the tone of voice you had. You really like can't operate in that way for a long period of time.
Well, in a relationship, you have the benefit of getting to know that person. So I know that with my wife, there's certain things that trigger her, and it's not wrong to do them. I just know that because of her upbringing and her personal experience, that those things make her upset. So I don't do them because I know that they make her upset, even though it's not wrong, right?
Yeah.
And there's other things that she's totally okay with that for most people would be triggering, and she's fine with them. Again, just because of her personality. And the challenge of removing context and removing relationship, it sounds like because everyone's next to each other, you're sort of always in relationship with everyone and not really in relationship with them at the same time. And so you can't get to know the personal triggers and personality of everyone in the world at the same time. And what you describe as feminine totalitarianism is that I don't like the tone of what you said, or you should just know what you did wrong. You can work with that with an individual if you get to know them, but with everyone at the same time, impossible.
Yeah, when it's so many people, it's literally impossible. I will say, actually, I don't know if I should adopt or change the terms because I do believe in like the male female polarity. But I will say that, like, just to qualify in case any women heard and got offended, like I actually do that also. I have like asked my wife, like, look, it's just how you said it, it's not what you said, so like I'm not casting aspersions at any particular group.
Well,
But
see, that's another contextual thing, is that I have read a lot of stuff from the New Age community where they talk about the divine masculine or the divine feminine. So my understanding of those terms and the way that they use them is that it is a polarity. And you could totally call it like apolarity and bipolarity. It's just that men tend to have one polarity and women tend to have another polarity. But they totally acknowledge that there's women who are more of the masculine polarity and men who are more of the feminine polarity, and see that as totally okay and totally fine. And there's people who have no polarity or both. See, like their view of that is what could be described as very progressive. But you're right that absent that context, someone might interpret it in a different way.
yeah, that's actually a really interesting, like, little example of like everything we've talked about. I mean, I think what it also ultimately comes down to, like, I feel like over time, everything that I've looked at, whether it's jobs I've had or art or spirituality, religions, every religion in and of itself, also macro ones, movements, denominations, then society in general, everything. I feel like the main theme almost sometimes is that there is an intrinsic human element that cannot be quantified or pinned down, that is not reducible to anything other than the fact that it is this intrinsic human element. And I feel like when I look at all those things I just mentioned, what I see over time is that eventually being stripped away and the problems that that causes. You know, like, it's almost like every job that I've had has gone from, you know, the movie Clerks or one of those 90s movies where people are like throwing things around and clocking in late and it's like 100% the human element. And then it slowly transitions to like Walmart where there's 100% hard and fast rules and that human element gets stripped out. Same thing with art movements. And then different churches have that problem, you know, no one in particular. It's like universal, really. And I feel like porting us over to this thing called the internet, it's really hard to keep that human element woven in. And I feel like when we don't, that's kind of where all the problems come up. And I just thought of it with that little example with the man-woman thing, because ultimately, like, the only way to avoid little miscommunications or offenses like that is by being charitable. You have to listen to what someone's saying and give them the benefit of the doubt. And when it's codified that that's not the case, I mean, can you even communicate in a situation like that? Is there any precedence for large-scale person-to-person communication where we assume the worst, you know, where we assume and try and strip out that, oh, well, everyone makes mistakes, you know, he didn't really mean it that way, probably. I don't even know if it's possible, man.
Well, even benefit of the doubt, at some point there are people who are behaving badly or engaging in things that are harmful. But even in real life, there's a different reaction to that and way of handling that. In other words, in real life, someone who's really, really bad, you can create distance from. On the internet, you can't quite create the same distance. Like, there's a person who I follow who's talked about how he had this relationship with a very psychopathic ex, and that she will just repeatedly create new accounts and message all of his friends and say whatever she thinks will get under their skin and destroy the relationship.
Wow.
And he has to repeatedly tell them, like, hey, so if you get a message from this person, it's my psychopathic ex and you should ignore everything that she says. But, like, that's a really hard thing for most people to process, and it obviously affects him.
Yeah, yeah. And also for someone where it's not a personal relationship, it's like, what does having that distance and creating that distance even accomplish? You know, I've had people, I don't know if you've had this, that would be interesting actually, but I've had it for sure, where people message me and say, you know, I noticed this person's following you, and maybe they repost your art. I've probably never even noticed. I don't notice all the people that retweet my art or something, or on other platforms. And they'll say, you know, you should block them. Like, why do you let this person engage with you? Like, blah, 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 blah. And a few times in the beginning, I don't do this now, but I would engage with them and I would say, well, if I block them, like, what would that accomplish? You know, here's this person. Let's say we both agree that this person's doing something bad. Maybe we don't, but let's say we do. If I just cut them off from seeing my stuff, I mean, literally, what does that accomplish? Nothing. Wouldn't it be better if I had them see my posts and what I'm saying, and maybe they could turn it around or change their view based on something I said? Like, why would I block them even? And I used to have that conversation with people. Like I said, I don't anymore. But it's just one of those interesting presuppositions of like, oh, why are you letting this person look at your stuff? Like, why are you should, don't you want to block the bad people? Like, don't you want to cut them off? You know, I think not analyzing those presuppositions is also like part of the hysteria.
Well, there's not a distinction between a parasocial relationship and being on stage or being right next to someone. So from your perspective, their audience, and from your friend bringing it to you as a problem, they're on stage with you. So if someone came to a performance that I did or a show, I don't think that anyone would view someone like buying my film on Amazon as something that I'm personally responsible for. But if I did a show with them, or we like co-produced a movie together, then I am a little bit more responsible for that relationship. That's a different choice than if I put something out there and they download it or see it. But the internet erases that distinction because we're all simultaneously performers and audience.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting one because, yeah, like for a film, that's a pretty long, involved process. Probably the most, if not one of the most, like long, involved processes that you could go through with another creator, I would imagine. And for me, I've had that problem with my graphic design work because someone will come ask me to do like a book cover, let's say, and I have to think, well, if I do the book cover for someone, am I like endorsing them? I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, you're an artist, you have this public persona. Yeah, you are. But on the other hand, it feels absurd. Like, would you go to like a graphic design studio and like say, hey, you made a book cover for this guy and it turns out he like, beat his wife this one time, like you endorse him, And it's another one of those spots where, what are the rules? I have no idea. Like if someone contacts me and says, I'm perfect example. I'm Mormon. I wrote a book about Mormonism. Can you do the cover for it? I mean, if I make the cover, am I like endorsing Mormonism? It feels like no, but
you've been converted.
Maybe.
Now I think you've officially are going to get into Mormon heaven. Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'll do it then. But that's another really weird place to play with, and it ties back into the online persona thing. Someone asked me to do a book cover about Buddhism. It's even a little bit easier because then they're like 100% not Christian. And it's like, well, do I have to say no because I don't want to endorse Buddhism? Like, are people going to get mad? Do I care? And then it ropes back into like politics. Like if someone writes a book about politics, do I have to read the whole book before I do the book cover? Like it's just a book cover, And it's another weird, ambiguous space that ties into this whole like amorphous fog of rules that no one knows, but we should know, I guess.
Well, also, according to whom? Yeah. Who is it that cares? That's the other difficulty is that if everyone's your neighbor, then everyone has a particular perspective on it. You have the challenge that your art is really distinctive. And I can spot one. I've seen a cover of a book and thought, oh, Owen did that. That's a really great cover.
Oh, nice.
And if you are doing like branded corporate art, it might be different because no one would know distinctively that it's yours. Whereas your art is really distinctive. So it's like there's a way in which your brand is then associated with them, at least in people's minds, even if it's like you're just doing a gig. And the distinction I've always made is that there's work that I post online on my website and then like work I'm hired to do. And if it's something that's a part of who I am as a person or creator, even then sometimes there's some stuff on my website that's very clearly just a portfolio piece that was, when I was doing professional editing work for other people and still occasionally do for other people. But the challenge there is that you are not merely a contractor, but also a brand.
It's true. Sometimes I feel like I have to like not think about it too much. Otherwise I could just get really like sucked into the meta aspect of it. It's kind of like for a while.
It's the mirror. It's the mirror again.
Yeah. For a while, I really resisted because I was interested in it, but I didn't want to look at it like theories of comedy and theories about what makes things funny and things like that because I was worried because I think I'm naturally funny. I don't know if other people do, but I do. And I was worried if I looked at that stuff and started thinking too much about it, that I would like become unfunny, that I would ruin this natural ability I have to like make jokes by thinking too much about what jokes are and things like that. It actually didn't happen, thankfully. But, I feel like with the internet persona and all that stuff, sometimes I feel like I have to just not think about it because I could get sucked into this like wormhole, honestly. I feel like I have to just do it naturally and just roll with it. Because once I start thinking, oh, I'm reading this book about Egyptian stuff. If I post about Egyptian stuff, are people going to think I'm pagan or something? But do I have to, eventually sometimes I have to just put it down and say, all right, I'm just going to do what I do and just roll with it, I guess.
Yeah, that are people going to think? One of the things that I have read is that part of the self-consciousness that people experience during middle school or when they're in that transition from being a kid to becoming more of an adult is that there's like an internal self-perception as being on a stage. And if you think about that transition in a small tribal community, there is a sense in which when you transition from childhood to adulthood, the people in the tribe probably would be looking at you. But the internet kind of has us all on a stage. So we're all having that self-reflective thing. By the way, are you familiar with the book Simulacra and Simulation?
Oh, yeah, dude, by Baudrillard? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for pronouncing his name first. I've always read it as like Baudrillard, but Baudrillard, is that the right pronunciation?
I think it's Baudrillard, but
it's a French name.
Honestly, I'm American and I'm not mostly self-educated, but kind of. So I've just leaned into the fact that I probably mispronounced some things, but I think it's Baudrillard.
So his analysis of the desert of the real really applies to the internet. And in the book, for those who are not familiar with this book, you've seen it in the movie The Matrix. It is where Neo is hiding his computer disks. It shows up in there. The book opens with a story about a king who commissions a 1-to-1 scale map of the world. So we're going to have a life-size map of the world. And he has this map, and because the map is so big, it covers the entire world. And it's a perfect scale. Everything that's in the world is on the map. But when they try to peel up the map and look underneath it, the map has replaced the world and there's a desert underneath because this map has covered all the trees, it's covered all the buildings, it's covered everything. And so what's underneath has been smothered and turned into desert. And he uses this analogy to talk about symbols, that we have covered the world with symbols and symbolic representations of things. And that by creating a symbolic map of the world, we have actually changed the real world and hidden it and created a desert of the real. And that is kind of what the internet has done. There is literally Google Maps, and there is a 1-to-1 map of the entire world. And now, I visited a restaurant down the street, and I asked my wife, do you want to go inside and look at the menu? And she says, no, I can pull it up on my phone. So the digital representation of that restaurant is now in some way more real than the physical place. And you were talking about how the internet is dictating the rules of real life. There's a sense in which the internet, by creating such a perfect map of the world, is replacing it. And very much fitting this postmodern analogy that Baudrillard was talking about many years ago.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that book because I almost pulled it out this morning when I was thinking about this interview, and I almost was thinking, should I reread part of that? But I was definitely thinking of it. It's definitely intrinsically tied to aspects of the internet for sure. I think the main distinction that I took away from that book was I mostly read it in an art context because it applies to art, but it also obviously applies to society more, you could say, is that I think a simulacra is a simulation of something where there actually isn't even a real thing underneath. The book's called that's like, and
yes.
Then a simulation, obviously people know what a simulation is. But I think about that a lot, man, because I have little notes in my mind of things that I experience primarily via their simulation. And as I thought about raising a kid, it's something I really want to try to avoid. Everything from like dumb things like I've obviously spent a lot of time like looking at my own brain, like in the mirror, like we were saying, and a lot of pop culture I know via things like The Simpsons. By watching The Simpsons, they would make a joke about something pop cultural, and that's how I know about it, which doesn't feel that weird, but if you actually think about it, that means that I'm experiencing it secondhand via the simulation. So I'll be out somewhere and someone will say, oh, like that guy, Tony Jackson, and I'll be like, oh yeah, but I only know Tony Jackson from The Simpsons,
right.
Or something like that, where I'm experiencing it via the simulation. And I think a lot of internet meta stuff has that aspect of it. I'm sure we could pin down like a trillion things where people never experience the real thing. They only experience like the joke about the thing or things like that. So yeah, I think that book had a premonition of a lot of aspects of the internet for sure. One of my one experience that I had that I suppose is really relevant to all this, that really relates to that is, so I mentioned I resisted getting a smartphone for as long as possible. And I finally got one. I remember when I got one, I had just broken up with this girl and I had this really cool painting job. I went somewhere and I painted this thing on the wall, and like an image, like a cool image. And I thought, okay, I just got Instagram. This is the kind of thing people Instagram, and I did some art. This is perfect. So I took my phone out, took a picture of it, and then people know this now, but on Instagram, you have those filters, right? So I turned up the contrast and I turned up the saturation, and I was like, man, this looks awesome. And I posted it, and I'm holding it in front of the painting. So I can't see the painting anymore. I can only see my phone. And when I took my phone down, I looked at the painting on the wall and I thought, man, that picture on my phone looks better than this painting does in real life. The picture actually looks better than the real painting itself. And for me, that's a very like Baudrillard moment, because another term that gets used sometimes, I don't know if Baudrillard used this term, but it's hyper reality, like a reality that's more real than the real. And that was that's my like first or really pinnacle of hyper reality moment. I'm looking at a picture I drew on my phone and it looks better than the real picture itself. And people are going to experience the altered photograph, the one that looks better, the hyper reality. Way more people are going to see that than the actual real life image. They're going to experience the simulation, but the simulation itself is of a heightened reality that isn't actually real.
It's so easy to manipulate people through that, because I've thought about this. It would be very easy to create or curate a reality for a particular person that made them think that something was a particular way or normal, or to get them to respond to a hyper reality rather than the real world. And I don't know if I want to get too political, but the QAnon movement is a really great example of that, where people were psyoped and then in some way psyoped themselves. They, through the internet, created this parallel reality where there's like this secret underground movement to overthrow all the bad people in the world, and then reacted as if that was the reality they were in, with pretty disastrous consequences for most of them.
Yeah, I really wish that there was like a 4-hour documentary about what happened at like, I don't know if it ended, but like the end of QAnon, like when those people had to like confront the fact that it wasn't playing out like they thought it would. I would watch like a 10-hour documentary about that. I am sympathetic as like a fellow crazy person in general. I never like got involved in QAnon, obviously, but anyone who like society points to and they say those people are crazy, I instantly am like, all right, I feel kind of tight with them though, actually. I don't really know anything about QAnon though, honestly. But yeah, no, I definitely know what you mean. And it creates this, it's almost like you start altering the lens through which you view the reality, and then you build up, like you were saying, this like false map of things.
Well, I use that example because it's one that I think people can now see was obviously and is obviously false. Like there's not a secret plan for the military to overthrow another secret group that's doing bad stuff. Like that just, it's clearly false now. But there's a lot of ways in which things happen like that are much more subtle. So people will kind of create their own filter bubble where they'll adopt like some fringe or weird view and then think everyone shares that fringe or weird view and start interacting with people in their life like they're in a reality where their particular view is normal.
Yeah.
And in earlier times, what would have happened is that they would have, in order to do the same thing, they would have either had to persuade the people they knew in real life of their particular view, or go to a commune or an intentional community and surround themselves with people who share that view, which like, I think that's great. Like if people want to join an intentional community and live in a different way, more power to them. But there's a way in which through the internet, people will think they're in the intentional community, or that their intentional community is the entire world, when they've actually just created a hyper reality that they're living in and an overlay of reality.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. I was wondering if we were going to hit the more like, I don't know what to call them, academic, but like weird, kind of like modern philosophy people like.
I love that stuff.
Yeah. So what you're saying also reminded me of something that I think is really interesting because it ties right into it. the internetization of society inherently creates the kind of situation that you're talking about, even without, like, let's say a weird like conspiracy theory, because you never know who is in on whatever the weird internet culture thing is. Like, if I meet someone at a party, this is a really tame example, but if I said, do you know what like a Wojak is? That would seem kind of stupid, right? But at the same time, I see posts on Twitter of Wojaks that have like 300,000 likes. So it puts you in this weird space of like, does everyone know about this or not? I had this interesting moment recently where, so I talked to some friends I haven't talked to in a really long time, told them I'm, having a kid and stuff. And they're like, oh, congratulations. And long story short, one of my friends says, oh, are you still, I forget what he asked. Doesn't matter. Like he said, like he was joking, like, oh, you're hopping over fences and, going through people's property, breaking the law or whatever. And I was going to say, no, I'm having this kid. I'm like a law cuck now. And as I was saying that, I could feel my brain start to slow down and say, can I say that? I guess I'm just going to say it. I don't know if they're going to know what I mean. And I said it and everyone laughed. And I kind of pocketed that moment. But then I went back to it later and thought, how do they know what that is? How do they know that that's funny or what that term means? It must be the internet. So I feel like the internet creates the situation where, like, QAnon's a perfect example. I mean, if you go to 7-Eleven and you're getting rung out by a cashier, if you're into QAnon, is it crazy to be like, hey, buddy, like, do you know about QAnon? Because they might. How would you know? And it kind of blurs that meta-narrative. There's not one, like, meta-narrative that everyone's partaking of. And I think once you, like, smash that, it's part of what puts people in that weird state. I think that it's really interesting to relate to the modern and quote-unquote, like, postmodern philosophers, because I was reading something and one of the standard definitions, I kind of forgot about this, I learned it a long time ago, but one of the standard definitions I've seen for postmodern is that it's characterized by a skepticism of meta-narratives. I think this guy named Lyotard, like Lyotard, defined postmodernism as a skepticism of meta-narratives. But I was thinking that's really interesting for us now, so far along down the road, because we're not really characterized by a skepticism of meta-narratives. We're actually characterized by a lack of meta-narratives. There's not really even a meta-narrative to be skeptical of. It's kind of just like a sea of information, and you can pick out of like 10,000 meta-narratives.
Yeah, see, I would have said a proliferation of meta-narratives. There's almost too many to name them all.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting, because then what, like, if we were going to, like, academia out, does that mean we're like postmodern because we're not skeptical of the meta-narratives, we just don't have them anymore? Like, what does that even mean? I think that's a really interesting space to, like, exist in. It kind of touches on, like, I don't know if you know about, like, liquid modernity and, like, these weird kind of generally kind of jargony academic terms for the fact that things just kind of feel weird temporally now. That's kind of like what it really boils down to, in my opinion. There's a guy named Mark Fisher. Have you ever heard of Mark Fisher before?
No.
Cool. So there's like a bunch of these like little guys. I haven't like studied them super hard, but not to trivialize them. I'm sure I'm the same way, but usually their stuff kind of boils down to like a few like key ideas. And Mark Fisher's whole thing that I picked up anyway is about the future being canceled. And that's kind of his like catchphrase, in my opinion, that the future is canceled. And I've listened to him talk about it, and it's pretty interesting because it has to do with like, the no more meta narratives and things like that. And I feel like it really is characterized by the internet becoming the main space, but it's almost this idea that like before, people used to kind of look forward to the future and we lived in this kind of pre-future state, but now it's not really like that anymore. And time, possibly because of these meta narratives, has kind of like dilated and become really fuzzy in this weird way. To make it less like abstract, a good example that he gave that I got from him is, if you took someone from the 50s and showed them music from the 80s, they would be like, wow, that's insane. Like, that's the music from the future. You guys are crazy. But if you took someone from the 90s and showed them the music from today, they'd probably have the opposite reaction. They'd say like, oh, that's the music from the future. It's kind of not that different than what we have going on now. And it's this kind of drifting into a space where there's not like a meta-narrative tugging things along. Everything's kind of connected. It's just this weird amorphous space that everyone's kind of floating in.
I'm not sure I understand that, because I actually do feel like the music today would be very different for a person in the 90s. Like if you were to play them vaporwave or really modern rap music, I think it might melt their brain a little bit. But maybe that's just my perception.
Maybe it would. It's hard to tell. Maybe it would. I could kind of see it both ways, honestly. In terms of like the form and stuff, it's like similar genres, but maybe it is different. But I really do respond to whether or not that specific example works. I kind of do respond to that idea of like drifting into this space that we're in right now. It's hard to pin down, but there's something about the way it intersects with the idea of the future that I feel like is interesting. It's almost like, I mean, you can't never tell what people from different time periods thought, but I feel like it's almost like instead of looking forward to the future, it's either not really there or it's too fuzzy, or it's almost like you're a little bit like scared of it in a way. I have this theory that like our time period relates really hard, aesthetically at least, with like the 1910s and the late 1890s. At least art-wise, I feel like that's true 100%, like in terms of the poetry and images. People can look up some artists called the Symbolists if you want to. It's something I'm really into. But I've often said they exist in kind of like a pre-future state where there's all this tech and, you know, cars and things like that, you know, first infiltrating their world. And they can tell that something crazy is coming around the corner, but they don't know what it is. And they don't know how the tech is going to change their society in a way. And you can sort of feel it in the art. And maybe it's too far out of left field, but with all the internet stuff, I feel like we're almost in a similar position. I mean, you'd have to be kind of stupid to not see that all this tech is about to, or already has, like radically changed the human experience. But at the same time, the scope of it and how fast it's happening prevents you from pinning down exactly what it will be. You don't know exactly how these things, it's kind of like what we've been talking about this whole time. You don't really know what the larger implications of all this stuff is, but you can see that something's obviously happening. I think that's like a weird space to like operate in as a person and also as a culture.
Well, it sounds like there isn't one meta-narrative, so there also isn't one meta-narrative about the future. So, you know, you mentioned, for example, the 1950s. The 1950s meta-narrative of the future was flying cars and like space race expansion that we would, you know, if you read the science fiction that came out then and shortly after, it was this idea that technology was just going to keep getting cooler and more convenient. And now, because there's not one meta-narrative, there's not one meta-narrative about the future. Like when you think of a narrative has a beginning, middle, and end. So our society was here, we are here now, and this is where we're going. And because people have a lot of different ideas, not just about where we're going, but where we are now, the future is a lot less clear. So if you are in one meta-narrative about the present, then that implies a different narrative about where we're going. But if not everyone in society agrees on where we are, then they might not be taking you in the same direction. And I think people, even if they do have a really strong meta-narrative they buy into, are aware that the rest of the world might be going a different direction. And if the rest of the world goes a different direction than them, then they might get pulled in that direction, and that direction might interact with them in a way that they don't understand. So if everyone is going a different direction, then we all might go one direction, but it's kind of hard to predict what it will.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe it's because I'm kind of like a fringy person, not in any particular way, but just in general. I think maybe, especially with the internet and everything, and then also in real life, that aspect has hit me like really hard, because I meet people who, you know, I guess over time I've come to call it like the epistemic divorce, just because there's a total divorce in terms of, you know, what things mean. We've been using the term meta-narrative. That's kind of what a meta-narrative is, though. It's like an epistemic like framework, because it's how you interpret information. But, you know, I meet people from across the board, and it's like, it's not even like they live in different countries. I mean, it's like they are existing in like totally different universes, and often the internet's a part of that. Although interestingly, sometimes it's not. I've met some people in real life with like some really crazy ideas, and I'll ask them, you know, where'd you get this from? And I'm expecting somewhere online, but they just kind of came up with it themselves. It's a whole nother topic though, I guess. But yeah, I feel like the epistemic divorce that the internet has caused is also like, I think that's like the defining characteristic of this time period. Honestly, I can't really wait for that to become like a popular term people use, because I feel like that is what's touched everything across the board. And it's almost the main thing people are talking about now. If I go home to my parents' house and turn on the news, normally they're not using that term, obviously, but they're talking about it in some way, because they're saying, here are these people, they're not part of the narrative. Here are these people, they're denying this thing we're saying, like, but it's true, don't worry about it. So it's almost like the hallmark of this time period. I don't know if other people are like talking about it or not, but yeah, I think about that a lot for sure.
It's really challenging because one of the requirements of conflict resolution is agreeing, and even just relationship in general, is agreeing on what happened. So if one person in the relationship thinks that, just as an example, the other is like cheating on them and the other person thinks that they aren't cheating, well, until they can agree on what actually happened, then there's not going to be conflict resolution, right? And then there's the meta narratives about what happened. So if one person, they all both agree on what happened, and one of them feels like it was a violation of the agreement of their relationship and the other doesn't, well, then they have to come to a shared agreement about what the relationship is. And right now, people are not even in agreement about what happened or is happening. There are multiple different narratives about every political event. There are multiple different narratives about even things like COVID and something like a virus, which should, you would think, be a factual thing, but actually it's like the least agreed upon thing in the world right now, probably because the stakes of it feel so high. But that happens in a lot smaller ways too. So people will have differing agreements or differing beliefs or realities about a relationship or about what was said, about all sorts of different things. I feel like the only solution to that is that there has to be an agreement that we are living in different realities and have different perceptions about what's happened. But what I see usually happening when people realize they're in different realities is they'll say, how do we get that other side in reality? And by reality, I mean my reality, which is the only reality, the objective reality. And everyone else's reality is obviously misinformation and false. And, you know, there's a lot of power that you can grab if you can enforce that view. If you can say my reality is the true reality and yours is not. There's a lot of epistemic power in that. But it does make connection impossible if both parties are playing a zero-sum game where they're trying to completely discredit the other person's reality and say, not even that, well, at least acknowledge like, hey, that's your reality and it's not what I think, but I acknowledge that, you know, that's how you see the world. Then there becomes instead a competition for whose meta-narrative is true about the other person's reality. So, you think that because and there'll be a meta-narrative about the reality. You're a racist, bigot, bad person, or you're a evil, liberal, Marxist, socialist, or you're like, there's a narrative about the fact that we have different narratives instead of like, let's at least acknowledge that we're in different realities.
Yeah, dude, honestly, man, that I never expected that would become such a defining aspect of my life. You know, I always joke with people in real life. I'm like, I just wanted to paint like flowers and stuff. And all of a sudden I'm like forced to unpack this.
I just wanted to make cool movies. That's all I wanted to make movies, maybe write some books or comic books or something.
Yeah, but I really, really deeply have wrestled with what you're describing because of my like particular situation where I'm from like liberal Mecca world, and then I moved eventually to a red state, and I've always been in like different realms, and I kind of think that I'm naturally sort of a meta person. Maybe that's why I gravitated towards the internet, but I really have thought about that a lot. And one of the most interesting things is that it's almost completely impossible to push through in real life. At least that's what I've experienced. I mean, with like my family, not friends, because, you know, with my friends I tried, but didn't work. With family, you know, you can have these long conversations, and like even just something as innocuous as what you made me think of it with the meta-narratives about meta-narratives thing, because even with something as innocuous as, for example, my mom, maybe obviously being a woman in the place that she lives, is like really, let's say, pro-abortion, right? And I was talking to her and I was like, she was saying, you know, these people that are against abortion, they just hate women. And I said, okay, we can make a little progress here. Okay, maybe you're totally right that abortion should be legal. Maybe you're 100% right, but I don't think the other people are thinking that because they hate women. maybe they're wrong, maybe they're crazy, but I don't think that's it. And I showed her all this stuff. I was like, here's this chart that says actually up until a few years ago, it was 50% men, 50% women against abortion. Like it was the same numbers. Basically, it wasn't split by gender. Here's this other stuff. And I was like, can you just admit that even if they're wrong and crazy, it might not be rooted in abject hatred of women? And dude, they couldn't do it. This didn't work with anyone. All the people I talked to, it didn't work with anyone. They were all just like, nah, sorry, it's about hating women. Like, that's it. That's the meta narrative, and I'm not changing it. So I think that maybe has colored my view on it a little bit. Also with the religious debate stuff, it's interesting because I think maybe I picked this up after watching a lot of debates with this guy, Jay Dyer, who is a really intense debater. I think most people are not really equipped to have like meta conversations, and they kind of come to an argument like that or a discussion like that as though it's operating on the level of like physical evidence. Like, well, we found this bloody knife. It's in Tanya's room. Therefore, Tanya was probably the murderer, or it has fingerprints. It has Devin's fingerprints. Okay, Devin was the murderer. Physical evidence does operate that way. I don't know if I'm cribbing this example from Jay Dyer, but if I am, go check him out. But that's not really the way that things in terms of worldview operate, because that evidence is always going to be interpreted in terms of the worldview. So my example was just perfect because I can show the stats and the numbers and all this stuff, but they're always going to interpret it in terms of the meta-narrative. So when you talk about conflicting viewpoints, it's almost always inherently a meta-level discussion that most people are not equipped to have. And that's really colored my view of all this stuff for sure. And then it ties back into the internet and everything also. But that's really colored my view a lot because most people aren't equipped to step up on the next step and look down and say, via what lens am I interpreting this evidence? They just want to go evidence to evidence, and it never works.
I recorded an entire podcast on the subject of narrative. And I think that you and I, as people who work in the arts, are very aware of these questions because art is all about constructing narrative and consciously constructing a narrative you know is not true. That's what writing fiction is. Like, it's a narrative that you made up. And weirdly, something that I think has really prepared me to think about that was growing up in a evangelical Christian community, because that community is constantly talking and thinking about their meta-narrative of the world and aware that their narrative, their assumptions about the world are different than the rest of the world. There's that whole Christian phrase of being in the world but not of it. So there's a requirement that you are interacting with people whose meta-narrative is different than yours, and that you understand them enough to communicate your meta-narrative, which in the case of evangelical Christianity is Christianity, and convince them of it. And to do that, you have to be able to step in someone else's reality. So I grew up knowing that my meta-narrative, or the meta-narrative that my family and community presented me with, was completely different than the rest of the world. And I think people who grew up in a secular or a household where they considered themselves normal have never had that experience, have never had the process of encountering people who have a different meta-narrative and having to communicate their reality to the other person. And certainly not the experience of most people having a different meta-narrative. And I've also really experienced that because I am neuroatypical. There's different labels that you could give that. Autistic is the most common, although I think even that symbol or name for it is incomplete or different. Like, people have different meta-narratives about autism. I recorded an episode recently with someone who had a very different meta-narrative. Mine is closer to the neurodiversity meta-narrative, but theirs was closer to the disease or dysfunction meta-narrative. So I use the word neuroatypical sometimes because people don't have a meta-narrative of that yet, usually.
That's interesting.
But I'm aware that my mind and way of perceiving things is different than others, and most people haven't had that experience. And so they assume that the facts and the meta-narrative are the same. Because if you are reading a book and in the story there's things that happen, the facts are a part of the narrative. But most people do not have the experience of separating the facts and the meta-narrative. And occasionally there's media that does that. There's media where you'll take the the bad guys of a previous story and try to tell the story from the bad guys' perspective and say like, well, from their perspective, they're the good guys. But it takes an entire film studio telling that story for people to get it.
Yeah, and people inherently like that because it's in art. I think they usually like it because it feels like a little bit of a flip. But like you're saying, in real life, I think they actually usually don't like it.
Well, people in art like nuanced characters, and in real life they like clear black and white. I'm on the right side.
I definitely really resonate with what you're saying about, you were in an evangelical spot, so you're aware that like, oh, I have this narrative that's different than other people, at least some people or most people actually probably, because I was on the other side of that, which is super interesting, where I grew up 100% in my own bubble of basically like the macro view of life being like Jon Stewart, The Daily Show, and truly having that lens of like everything outside of this is purely motivated by irrationality and craziness. Period, 100%. I really actually thought that and lived that way for a while. Because, you grow up in it, you don't really think about it. I have this one time that I think about sometimes now where I was driving along. I remember this perfectly. I remember exactly where I was. We were driving along. I was in the passenger seat in some random place. And I looked over and I saw a guy with a big sign that said something like, abortion is murder or stop abortion or something. And where I'm from, that would be that I never saw it. I only saw it one time my whole life that I was there. And dude, when I saw that, it literally would have been less weird for me to see a full-on UFO landed on the side of the road. Like seeing that a real person went out with a sign to say stop abortion, it like totally. It was like seeing a square circle on the side of the road. Like, honestly, it was so reality puncturing that I really couldn't believe it. And I think that kind of like encapsulates what it felt like to be on the other side of what you're saying, where, whoa. We have the normal view. Who are these people with a different view? What the heck? I really also encountered that as I was getting older and my views became more nuanced, because I noticed that no matter what the view was, even before I don't think I figured even like 3 to 5% of things out now, but when I really was at 0%, I noticed there was a huge difference between people whose view was, I have a particular meta narrative and it affects how I view things, versus people who were like, I'm just seeing things normally. And that you could really reason with the first group, but not the second group.
Because they're self-aware. They know that they have a meta-narrative.
Exactly. And one of my friends from college, he basically, eventually I had to stop talking. I didn't stop, but, it's sort of a long story. We eventually parted ways, let's say, with a lot of people from my past for various reasons. But one guy, he was on the total opposite wavelength as me in like every aspect. Like when I linked back up with him, like he was literally doing like communist organizing for this like hardcore like Maoist Leninist group or something. Like it was pretty like, whatever, it's his vibe, but it was pretty like intense. But it was funny because out of all the people, it was almost like I could talk to him the easiest because he knew I have this view, it colors how I view things, so do other people. So it's really funny because even someone on the total other end of the spectrum that I happened to manifest on in that particular moment in time, it was like, wow, I could talk to you the easiest because you're aware that the human beings have larger narratives that allow them to interpret things.
Yeah, on the flip side, I've noticed that the hardest people to talk to are people who have a meta-narrative about who you are before you've told them anything about yourself. So if someone is looking at you through the lens of you're this, then they're searching for confirming evidence of that viewpoint. And it's a really challenging dance to do because you have to be aware of their meta-narrative about you and then deliberately do and say things that violate that previous belief. And even when I've done this consciously with people, it's still like, I can interpret even this thing that went against my entire model of the world as actually being a part of my model of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done that with people, man. I've tried to push that stone up that hill so hard. There's a few like logical fallacies it usually entails, but usually it's like the appeal to motivation fallacy where, it's kind of like underneath what you're saying, where it's like you only think that because X, or you think that because you're this type of person and stuff. And yeah, I've tried to unpack that with people and it's basically impossible. My example that I just gave should be like put in terms of, I mean, I was like good friends with that guy a long time ago. So that definitely colored it because we both like knew each other. If that wasn't the case, it probably wouldn't have played out that way. But yeah, it's almost impossible to puncture through. I mean, I got kind of into studying like this guy, I think his name's Robert Lifton, wrote a book called Psychology of Totalism. And it's all about like the methods of enacting like a total psychological system on people. And it goes through this list of like 10 things. If people have never heard of it, you should just go on the Wikipedia page and you can just read the points. The Wikipedia page is actually really good at summarizing the different points and stuff. But it has all these little things of like, oh, other people think differently because X. That's pretty much always the reason why, you know? And even in real life, I could try and push through that with people. What's a good example? Immigration is kind of a good example, however you feel about it, because some people have the meta-narrative of anyone that says anything bad about immigration is doing it because they hate X group of people. And you can try and push through it and be like, but isn't it possible at least that someone, even if they're wrong, has this other angle and view, you know? And it's really difficult to push through those narratives. And like you said, you have to do it very carefully. You have to say, you know, even if you're right, I actually kind of agree with you, but couldn't it be the case that the other people aren't just crazy or hateful? And it's pretty hard to like push through that, man.
One of the interesting things I've noticed is that even when I agree with someone, if I try to challenge their meta narrative about other people, which I almost always want to do because my meta narrative about humans in general is that they, at least most of them, have a reason, like there's a reason why people are the way they are, and they are reaching for the best level of consciousness or way of being that they can, even if they're doing a really bad job and hurting other people. And actually, even if they're consciously trying to hurt other people. So I'm always wanting to say like, oh, can we have greater empathy? Can we have greater connection? And one of the things I've noticed is that in the past, at least, when I've tried to do that with someone who has a meta-narrative about the out-group or the other group, they will assume I'm a part of that group and begin applying the meta-narrative to me.
Oh, dude, exactly. What you just described, exactly. You can't like defend the group without being seen as like a part of it, even if it's just purely for the purposes of like going deeper into an idea or something like that. For sure, man. That's definitely the case.
Because we've basically reached Joe Rogan lengths of an episode now. One of the things that I've noticed is that people will do that, especially to someone like Joe, when he interviews someone and has a conversation with them, they'll be like, oh, he must endorse them. He must be part of that group. So there's a similar assumption or meta-narrative applied to him.
Yeah, well, it kind of ties back to what we were talking about before, where it's like, well, why would you engage with this person if you didn't, you know, want to propagate their ideas? Why would you, like, you know, like we said before, let this person look at your Twitter feed if you don't want that kind of person looking at your Twitter feed, you know? It's another one of those weird, like, amorphous rule things, when in reality that should be the opposite. Shouldn't I be like engaging with people that don't agree with me so I can convince them, even if I'm like 100% right and they're 0% right? I mean, shouldn't I be doing that?
Well, it's a lack of clarity about whose space you're in. So if I go visit a foreign country or I go visit a space, then maybe I am responsible for the choice to go visit. But if it's very clearly a foreign country or a place that's not my space, I'm not responsible for what happens there. And actually, ironically, using the phrase MySpace, the earliest of internet social media, MySpace was a very different platform because you basically made a web page that was your web page, and people would customize it and they'd put little filters and they might put music on it, but it was their space. And then like there was links to other people's space, but you would curate that space. You'd have your top 6 friends, right? And people would, you know, there's like a little social thing as which of your friends you'd include in your top 6. But that was a curated space. That was your space. And now MySpace, people don't remember, did not have a feed. So now there's a feed and it's not clear whose space it is. And so if someone interacts with my feed, is that my space or is that a shared space? It's not really clear. It functions like a shared space, but I might have been the initial person to create that space in some way, but it functionally is shared.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I experienced that for sure. Like someone, like we said before, like someone comments on your thing and it's like, well, am I responsible for this? Not really. I think when it's applied to society at large, it gets like a little bit more dicey. You mentioned the kind of, I don't know if you mentioned it or I did, but the kind of like family analogy or, it was the relationship analogy of like, two people can't even agree on what happened, so they can't move forward. It's interesting because I feel like in those situations, I don't know if this is like a positive or negative conclusion, but for family stuff, I feel like usually the only way forward is to accept that the other person has a different meta narrative, and maybe you don't talk about it, or maybe you just accept that they are that way. But I don't know what the social like implications of that would be. I don't know how to step back into a place where it's okay to entertain basically anything. And I feel like that is another part of, just sort of tie back into like the initial topic. That was a big part of, I think, why I started broadcasting my thoughts online, even to begin with, because I don't know if it was conscious or not, but I felt like, I have a lot of weird ideas or weird views on things. And I think people think that if you have those ideas, you have to be a certain kind of person. And wouldn't it be cool to show that like you don't have to be? Like we almost live via these like stereotypes that are part of these like meta narratives. And I feel like that was a big part of my early online life, was sort of putting it out there and saying, yeah, what if someone had this crazy idea, but they weren't the kind of person that you think they are? It sounds very like after school, especially. Of course, it wasn't that like intentional, but I don't really know. I engage with that a lot. I don't know if this is too much of like a whole another topic, but in terms of like the science stuff, especially, because that's another like meta narrative situation where it feels like if you just ask certain questions, even if you're genuinely trying to understand, people will interpret you as attacking the system because that's part of their meta narrative. And I experience that all the time, even with like topics that should be completely and totally uncontroversial, like, I don't know, gravity or like the solar system or something, people throw up the firewall and they're like, oh, he's one of those people trying to, and I'm like, what, trying to attack like gravity? Like, what's the deal?
Well, science, I find that very often academics and scientists have meta narratives that they are not aware of. So you'll see this. So my film was about the issue of circumcision. You'll see it a lot there, where people will do a study and they'll claim that, and often these studies are highly flawed in and of themselves, but that's another topic. They'll claim like, well, you can reduce the incidence of like this type of infection by 0.5% if you cut part of the body off. And then they'll say, so that means we should cut part of the body off. And it's like, no, it doesn't mean that. That's a narrative you drew from the data. The reduction of a certain percent of a type of infection is the fact. The meta narrative that means you should do something is a narrative. And you could equally draw the opposite narrative from data. So one of the things that people talk about in my film is how circumcision reduces sexual sensation, or the number of nerve endings in male genitals. And they will say, well, that's evidence that you shouldn't do it. But there's early Jewish writing from Moses Maimonides who says that that's a good thing, because if people have less sexual sensation, then they'll focus on sex less. And he was sort of a very anti-sex religious writer. And so in that meta-narrative, the fact that it reduces nerve endings and sexual sensation is good. But for most people, the meta-narrative of it reduces sensation is bad. So when they hear the fact, they will try to debate the fact as opposed to the narrative about it. Because how could anyone want less sexual stimulation? Like, why? That sounds awful, right? And I see the same thing around, for example, autism research. Very often autism researchers will frame every study on autism as negative. So for example, they did one study finding that autistic people lie less and are more uncomfortable with lies. And they frame this as like, oh, well, autistic people don't have imagination and don't know how to make things up. And it's like, or you could interpret that as they're more moral, as they have a greater commitment to the truth. And if you were to interpret this as a positive, wouldn't we want more people who lie less? When you get into like the data around COVID, people will say, oh, well, this will reduce COVID a certain way. And it's like, even if that's true, going from that this reduces COVID infections by a certain amount to we should all do it and punish anyone in society who doesn't want to do it is a narrative. It's a value judgment that you're making based on the fact.
Yeah, totally. I guess in a way, maybe subconsciously, maybe explicitly, it kind of feels like that stand of scientific facts are just facts that exist without a larger narrative in and of themselves, and you bring the interpretation to them. I think in some way for me, it feels like a little bit of like a last stand, not in the sense of like a hill that I want to die on, but in the sense of, man, if we can't even look at like this machine gave us this number without putting like implications on that information, like we're not going to be able to do anything else. So it kind of feels like it's so easy to unpack in a way that, you know, the data doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you what is. That maybe like in my heart somewhere, I really feel like, come on, like I'm looking at everyone in society. I'm like, come on, this is one hill we can get over. It's a baby hill. It's a foothill at the base of the mountain, but we can do this one. We can all agree that, you know, the numbers don't tell you what to do. But then at the same time, I'm like, maybe that's just kind of like foolhardy, honestly. I don't know if most people are equipped for like, you know, meta ethics and like these larger conversations and stuff like that.
Well, it's also kind of, it's not really how humans are wired. We're very much wired to view life through meaning and narratives, not merely information. We feel things. And going back to the internet, you know, it's similar to food. Our taste buds are evolved to prefer certain tastes. And now with food products, we've engineered certain foods to just trigger those taste buds without actually adding any nutritional value. And so it's very easy for people to get addicted to basically totally processed foods because it's triggering that thing. It's almost like an exploit in the human consciousness that wouldn't have been possible prior to technology. And it seems like the internet is doing something similar around people's need and desire for connection and meta narratives, to their need for belonging. Like we've kind of created the processed food version of meta narrative.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this to him before, William James. I don't know if the previous quote was from him, but this one definitely is, where he said, I think it's in Variety of Religious Experience. He said that something like this: beliefs, in terms of a religious system, beliefs only, I don't know if he used the word matter, but beliefs only, like, I'll use the word matter to people on the ground if they do something about them or if they play a role in some active process. And I think that's really true in terms of like the religious studies I've done. Like there's actually a special subsection in theological stuff called adiaphora. And adiaphora is things that are kind of explicitly, I don't want to say they don't matter, but they're like not really worth getting worked up about. You know, something like, let's make up an example, like how many flowers are supposed to be on the side of the altar, or, you know, something like that. How many pews do we have in the church? Well, some people say it's 10, some people say it's 12, but it's just like adiaphora. It's not really a big deal. And I think that once I read that about beliefs only really mattering if you can do something about them, I think a lot of the theological minutia feels like minutia because it doesn't play a role in the average person's religious life. There's huge aspects of, you know, Orthodoxy or Catholicism or even being Baptist or something that don't necessarily play a role in every random person's life every day. So they're kind of just, you know, fall in like the folder of random stuff, let's say. But I think that's really interesting to apply to beliefs in terms of non-religious systems, because it's the same exact way. If you have a belief, you need to be able to do something about it. And it's almost like this aspect of social media and the internet gives people a way to, quote unquote, do something about this belief they have, whether it's a belief about this scientific reality or this, you know, other social event or something like that. Spiritually, you could say it doesn't really feel like enough to just be sitting at your table and say, yep, I feel X way about Y. You need to do something about it. And I think that that's part of what's feeding into the whole social media internet thing. It gives people that outlet the same way that, you know, if you had a holiday celebrating some saint, it would allow you to enact the celebration of that saint and make that belief tangible.
So people need meta-narratives to organize the facts. That's actually, if I just tell you a random fact, you probably won't remember it. But if I tell you a random fact in the context of a story, you might. But once you've heard the story, stories usually have something they're trying to impart, or they make you feel a certain way and you feel like you need to do something in response to that story. And so social media and the internet as it currently exists blasts you with information. So you have a deep need for narratives to contextualize it. But then once you have those narratives, you have to do something about them. And the internet has something to offer there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, right, it's called social media. Media is sort of the operative word there, you know? At least back when I was on Facebook, I'm sure it's probably still the same way now, but in general, like, it ties back to these amorphous spaces things because it's like, well, here all your friends and family are on this platform and they probably just want to see pics of like your dog and your kid and you snowboarding. But if you have this issue that you feel really, really strong about, I mean, isn't it kind of your job to tell them? Like, is it your job? Is it your, not even job, is it your responsibility to raise awareness, another really good buzzword, about like this particular issue, you know? And I think people subconsciously, I don't want to say get off on it, but they really do enjoy that. Like there's almost this rush you can feel in the text when you read it where someone says like, yeah, I know people are going to get mad, but, you know, I feel really strongly about this. I think people just need to know that, like, you know, here's this study, here's this data, please do this, you know. It's a way of gripping this otherwise non-physical thing that is your belief about something and making it tangible.
It's also, if you see someone on stage, you want to see a performance, you want to see them going off, you want to see drama, and the internet rewards all those things.
Yeah, it does.
So this has been really interesting. We've gone longer than any other episode I've recorded, and I still feel like we could keep talking. Before we finish, totally, I want to make a suggestion that I've made in your Twitter comments before, which is that you should write a book about all this. And now that we've had this conversation, I would totally co-write a book about this. So
yeah, I have the substructure through the talk, I guess, right?
Well, because, so even you sent me ahead of time before this conversation, you sent me links to Twitter threads that you'd done on this. And I actually, many of them were ones I'd searched and found in preparing for the show and thinking about what questions to ask. And like we mentioned, the internet forgets in a certain way. So if those threads aren't immediately on someone's feed, they disappear. But books have a different remaining power. It's one of the reasons that I often encouraging friends of mine to publish, and people don't realize that the internet has made it as easy to publish a book, maybe slightly, but like not much more difficult than publishing a post on social media. You and I, we could publish the transcript of this conversation as a book and have it on Amazon in 3 days.
Yeah.
But
I am gonna do something like that for sure. I'm wrapping up a book right now that I'm basically done with. That's like a collection of my comics, and then I have one other thing kind of sketched out, and then after that, I do want to hit something like along this topic for sure.
I feel very strongly about books as a medium that, like, if you're publishing, you know, I wouldn't just publish a transcript, or I would curate it in some way if I was. Come to think of it, one of the books I thought of when thinking about this was René Girard's Things Hidden Since the Foundations of the World, which is transcripts of a conversation with him and a journalist. So,
well, that's interesting.
Yeah, like I didn't realize that until I picked it up. But it's Peter Thiel's favorite philosophical book. It's hugely influential. So you can do that, but I feel like I would want, if, you know, with this topic, I'd want to curate it and write it and think it through. And so if you decide to do your own thing, I'm going to be first in line for it. If you wanted to work with me on it, I would be totally interested in that. I do feel like from this conversation, one angle you could do a book in this way for is a normal person's guide to surviving the psychoactive drug that is the internet.
Yeah.
I don't know what you'd title it, but like a normal person's guide to surviving the internet would be like a subtitle.
Yeah, I'll think about that. Maybe we should do something like that. Yeah, I mean, that kind of like, it's a perfect kind of like wrap up for everything. But yeah, I mean, I feel like part of the reason why I thought about all this stuff so much was just seeing it warp the brains of people around me and my brain. I'm not immune to it, obviously. And just asking, you know, you ask yourself the question, who's gonna figure this out? And you're like, well, I'm not really equipped, but I'm the only one in the room right now, so I'll just kind of take a stab at it, I guess.
If you do the intellectual work, you're the person to figure it out. I would like to offer one unsolicited piece of writing advice / thoughts on how to do this, which is, so I'm finishing a book right now that's about 100,000 words, and you did the cover to my previous book, or actually, I've done 2 books now. One of them is fiction, but to the book, the Intactivist Guidebook.
Yes.
And if you know your topics, then you turn them into chapter titles, and then you write maybe 3,000 words on each. So you'd have, if we did this, it'd be like, how the internet flattens space. That's a chapter. And how the internet flattens time. How the internet places you on stage. How the internet is a mirror. Like, you just sort of go through those things we've talked about. 3,000 words is about the amount that you could write in a day or in one sitting, which is why I usually frame it that way. But if you just know those are your topics, put 10 of them down. 10 3,000 word chapters is a 30,000 word book. The first Harry Potter novel is 70,000 words. So,
whoa, interesting.
Yeah. So if you do that twice, if you have 20 topics like that, you have a book the size of Harry Potter.
Wow, that's pretty big.
But you can do each of those, 20, think about that, that's 20 writing sessions. For me, 3,000 words takes about, I usually do about 1,000 words an hour. There's some people who are faster, and this book might also be faster because like the one I'm doing now involves a lot of academic research and footnotes. So if you think about it, that's 20 days of consecutive writing. You could have it in a month if you want it. Obviously you can take longer with the stuff I'm doing now. Sometimes you have to sit and think about it a little bit. I want to put that out there as like, it's very doable. I think it's a good topic.
Me that. Yeah, no, I appreciate you telling me that you feel that way. Yeah, I'm kind of gunning right now for the holiday season. I got this calendar and the comic book, and then after that, I kind of clear things up, and I'm going to see. I am thinking more like, it's a funny internet thing, in terms of my operation, like, beefing things up, and books has definitely been on my radar for sure.
Well, I'm putting it out there. I would love to work on it with you. If you want to do it solo, that's totally cool too. I just wanted to share that thought.
Cool, man. Yeah, I'll definitely think about that.
All right. Is there anything you want to add before we finish?
Honestly, no. That was really fun, and I really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, I guess since we both think we can keep talking, maybe we should just put a pause on it and maybe pick up, we'll do episode 2 or something at some point down the road.
I would be down. My thought for that would be to just pick a different topic for the next episode.
Yeah, for sure.
So if we did one on spirituality and art, if we did one on, there's a million different topics. So
art is pretty good. That's also like interesting because I am very interested in like talking to people that are very well versed in their own mediums that's different than art, because there's, even we're not going to go into it right now, but even just like between painting and film, there's a bunch of really weird, interesting things, because I make still images, you make moving images. Like there's a lot of really weird, interesting things to like unpack in terms of art in general, for sure.
So before we wrap up, where can people find you on the internet? Speaking of the internet, where should they go?
Great question. The main hub is my Twitter. It's at Owen Broadcast. That's the main spot. If you're there, you're not going to miss anything else. But I also do post on Instagram and Tumblr, same usernames, getting the art out there. I have a painting show I do on YouTube every Tuesday night. It's kind of weird art, Bob Ross, spiritual stuff, talking about weird symbolism and religion, but also just general topics. And it's a pretty good time. It's a great time, actually. It's on 7 p.m. EST on YouTube. Same name, Owen Cyclops. I'm on Telegram, Owen Cyclops. And if you go to those places, that's the story right now. Wait, one last thing. I have a website, obviously. It's owencyclops.com. And one of the other main things I do is sell art and shirts and prints and stuff like that. Helps me run my little theological weirdo art studio, but also I do only release stuff I think is cool. So if you want to check that out, it's on my website. It's owencyclops.com.
I'd like to add that his art and merch is phenomenal. I have pictures he's done that hang on my wall and t-shirts, and he does commissions and charges too little for them. So you should pay him more than he offers to do it for, except for me, which is a perfectly reasonable, fair price. And it's great work.
Awesome, man. Thanks for the endorsement.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. Well, I think we'll end it there.
Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.